I died on a wet road with a stranger's collar in my fist. 10 days later, I stood in a village square and watched a man named Tavis Cray saw a woman's foot off because she had stepped on a nail. Nobody in that square was angry about it. You need to understand that before anything else in this account. Her own mother held the bowl and thanked him for coming so quickly. I was a trauma doctor for 8 years. I could have saved that foot in about 40 minutes with a knife, a pot of boiling water, and a length of clean thread, and I was not allowed to say one word. My name is Mark Hale. I was 34 when a car went over on the ramp outside the depot, and I did what anybody with my job does, which is walk towards it instead of away. The driver was a man I never learned the name of. He was pinned by the belt and screaming, and I got the buckle open and had him halfway out of the window when the tanker behind us let go. There was a flat white noise and a shove of heat, and then nothing that I can put in order. I remember the pain arriving in my hands last, which is a thing your body does when it is deciding what to save. Then I was face down in cut stubble under 2 suns, with my palms sliced open in 8 or 10 places and grit ground into the cuts. My first coherent thought was that this needed irrigating. That is not a heroic thought. It is just what I have instead of a personality. I pulled straw out of the cuts with my teeth because I had no water, and I sat up and looked at a world that was not mine. 2 suns, one high and one low and orange, wheat stubble, a cart track, hills with a real pass cut through them, and a village down the slope with smoke over it. A man came along the cart track with a yoke and 2 buckets while I was still on my knees in the stubble. He looked at my clothes, looked at my open hands, and kept walking. He had no left arm from just above the elbow. No panel appeared in front of my eyes, and no voice told me what I was now. Put that on the record early, because for 12 years afterwards, people insisted that a voice must have told me something. I had a body, a pair of hands, ruined shoes, and 8 years of standing over people bleeding on a floor. That was everything that came across with me, and it turned out to be enough. I walked down to the village because the alternative was sitting in a field. The track had a marker stone at the fork with letters on it I could read, which frightened me more than the 2 suns did. Low hollow, 40 houses, a mill wheel, a chapel with a sun cut into the door. A woman at the first gate looked at me and said nothing at all about my clothes, and I understood why about 4 steps later. She was missing 3 fingers on her right hand, not lost in an accident that week. An old healed stump, taken at the middle joints, the skin drawn over the ends as a bad closure always heals. Behind her, a man was splitting kindling with a hatchet, held in a fist with no thumb on it. The next man had a leg off below the knee and a crutch worn shiny at the top from years of use. I stood in the lane and did what I have done in every waiting room in my life, which is count. 19 adults in sight. 9 of them were missing something. A hand, a foot, 2 fingers off one, a whole arm off another, a boy of about 10 with a thumb gone, a grandmother with both legs off at mid-shin, sitting in a barrow with her hands folded. Then I started reading them properly because that is worse. That stump is an amputation, not a birth defect. That arm is a fracture that was never set and healed with a bend in it. That man's shin has a hole in it that has been draining for years, which is bone infection, and it will drain until it kills him. That woman's jaw is swollen from a tooth root, and she is going to die of it. I have worked in bad places. I have never in my life walked into a settlement of 40 houses where half the working adults were mutilated, and every single injury was one a first year could have handled. So I went back to the woman at the first gate, because she was the smallest problem in that village, and because I could not walk past her twice. Her name was Hesta. 3 fingers gone off the right hand years ago. On the hand she had left, the index finger was swollen from the tip to the middle joint, tight and shiny. She was holding it up above her chest without knowing that she was doing it. That is a whitlow. Pus under the skin beside the nail, pressing on the bone, and it had kept her awake for 3 nights. In this world, it goes into the joint in about a week, and then a bone setter takes the finger, and sometimes the hand. I asked her for boiling water. She had a kettle over the fire for tea, which is how I found out that every single house in Ordain boils water twice a day, and nobody had ever once pointed it at a wound. I took a blackthorn out of the hedge by the gate, held the point in the fire until it was black, washed my hands and her finger, and put 1 stab into the side of the nail fold while she looked at the wall. It went about 2/3 of a thumb joint deep, and about a spoon of yellow came out of it, and she made a noise like somebody putting down a sack. Then she opened and closed the finger, twice, and looked at me properly for the first time. She asked what she owed me. I told her to keep the hole open for 2 days, boil the cloth before she used it, and not to let anybody bandage it tight. She said the pain had stopped. She said it in the tone of a woman reporting something impossible. Then she thanked me and told me it was a pity I had not come a week earlier, because her sister Sarah had stood on a nail and the rot was above the ankle now, and they were taking the foot at noon. A boy came out of a gate with a heel of bread and gave it to me without being asked. 10 or 12 years old, brown, filthy, both legs, all fingers, a stick under his arm, and a dog behind him. He said his name was Yoon, and he had a herd of 6 goats, and he was not supposed to talk to strangers from the road. Then he asked whether I was a bone setter, because I had a bone setter's stare. I asked him what a bone setter was, and he told me it was a man who took the rot off you. He said it the way a child tells you what a farrier is, a trade, a useful man who comes when you need him. Then he said one was in the square right now, and did I want to watch? And he was already running. I followed him because a man in my position follows the only person being friendly to him. There were about 60 people in the square. Sarah sat on a bench in the middle of them with her left leg out on a block, and a man in a leather apron was laying out tools on a cloth beside her. The tools were good. The tools are the thing that put ice in me. A hand saw with a fine blade, 3 knives, a spool of waxed thread, a screw tourniquet, a set of curved needles, a folding case with a maker's mark. Someone with skill had made those. Someone with skill was using them. This was not a superstition being practiced in a barn. It was a licensed trade with a charter and a toolkit and a fee. The man in the apron was 60-odd, gray, close-cropped, with forearms like a butcher and reading glasses of ground crystal on a cord. Somebody called him master and he did not look up. I got close enough to see the leg, sole of the foot, a puncture on the ball, 4 days old by the look of it. Edges rolled and gray. From the puncture, a red line went up the inside of the ankle. It reached about 2/3 up the calf and stopped in a hard swollen band. Below that band, the skin was tight and shiny, and the woman's toes were the color of a bruise. The smell reached me a second later. That is cellulitis running up a tendon sheath, with an abscess sitting under the arch of the foot, 4 days. If you gave me a scalpel and a pot of water, I would have had the pus out of it inside an hour. Open the arch, wash it until the water runs clean, leave the hole open with a drain in it, keep the leg up, she keeps the foot, she limps for a month. The entire treatment is those 4 sentences. Instead, the master in the apron laid a strap above her knee, wound the screw down until the leg went white, and told her she was a sensible woman for coming in before it reached the joint. She thanked him. Her mother thanked him. 2 neighbors took her shoulders, and a third took her thigh. A fourth put a folded belt between her teeth, and a fifth held a bowl of poppy draft to her mouth. I got about 4 words out. I said, "Stop. I have just opened one of these on her sister's hand." My voice did something in a public square that it had never done in a hospital corridor, which has come out thin. 2 men had me by the arms before I finished, not roughly. The way you move a stranger out of the way of a working man. One of them told me to hold my noise and let the master do his trade. The saw took 11 strokes. I counted, because counting is what I do, instead of screaming. She got through 5 of them before the belt came out of her teeth, and she stopped making any noise that was words. He worked fast and he worked well, and the obscenity of it is exactly there. Flap of skin turned back, muscle cut clean above the swelling, saw through the tibia and the fibula, artery tied off with the waxed thread. Then he pressed hot pitch onto the stump to close it. I watched him seal an unwashed wound with tar under a bandage that had been used before, and my hands started shaking again. Her mother paid him from a purse, counting out loud so the neighbors could hear it was honest. 8 silver for the limb, 2 more for the crutch, from his own cart. A month of poppy draft, price agreed. 10 silver and a month of poppy for a foot that needed a wash. I stood there and did the arithmetic I would spend the next 12 years of my life doing. The arithmetic never once came out in their favor. The crowd did not disperse in shame. They stayed and talked to the mother about the harvest. A man clapped the master on the shoulder. Somebody brought out beer for him. When it was over, I got to him. He was cleaning the saw with a rag and a wetted thumb. He licked the thumb before he wiped the blade, and I heard my own voice go flat and careful. I asked him why the foot had to come off. He looked up at me with the crystal lenses down his nose and gave me the answer that runs this entire world. He gave it patiently, the way you explain a season. He said the rot goes up. He said it starts in the flesh and it climbs, and once it is climbing, there is nothing on this earth that turns it back. So you cut below the rot before it reaches the middle of her. Then he said something worse, and he said it without any cruelty at all. He said about half live. He said the other half die whatever you do, because the rot was already too high when they came in. So there is the machine, all of it. It is not stupidity. Half of them do live. Half of them get up on a crutch and go back to work and stand in the square as living proof that the method functions. Nobody in Ordain has ever seen the other option, so there is nothing to compare it to. A world where a wound can be washed and closed and kept has never existed here. Not once, not anywhere. I asked him his name, mostly to have something to hold. He told me Tavis Cray, master of the Bone Setters Guild, that he had a charter and a school and a license to work 6 of these valleys. I asked how many limbs he had taken. He thought about it as a carpenter thinks about doors, and he said a little over 200. There was pride in the number, and no shame anywhere near it. Remember that number? I did. 200 limbs taken by a competent man with good tools who believed every single time that he was saving a life, and who was right about half the time. The chapel priest came over then, a young man called Brother Halm. He blessed the stump and told the mother the light had done what it could. I asked him what that meant, because I had to know. He said he had closed the wound on the 2nd day. He turned the woman's ankle for me to see, and there it was, a straight pink scar across the sole, healed shut, closed over the puncture, closed over the dirt. He had sealed it all in with the filth still under it. Then the arch had cooked for 2 days behind a good closure. Everybody involved had watched it get worse and called it the will of the light. So now I had the second half of the machine. The light shuts a tear and stops blood. It does not touch what is already growing inside. The priests know it. They have a phrase ready for when the patient dies anyway. I walked out of that square with my sliced palms and no water and no tools and no name in this world. I could not make my legs go towards the road out of the valley. I sat on the mill wall until dark, because I could not get around the arithmetic. In one village of 40 houses, I had counted 9 mutilations. Every one of them was a wound that a washed hand and an open drain would have beaten. Multiply that by every village on the road. Multiply it by a kingdom. Multiply it by the 2 other kinds of people I did not know existed yet, who do not even get a bone setter, because a bone setter is a luxury. I did not decide to change anything that night, and I am trying to be accurate about it. I sat on a wall with a heel of bread going stale in my fist and thought about how tired I was and how I did not want any of this. Yun found me there and sat on the wall too and asked if I would still be in the village tomorrow, and told me the goats got into the thorn break at the top field every single morning, without fail. Then he told me he was the one who went in after them, because he was smallest. He showed me the sticks in the break, and they were blackthorn, and every one of them was as long as my forearm. I went to sleep in the mill loft with my hands wrapped in my own shirt. I did not know it yet, but every single thing that happened for the next 12 years came out of the next morning. Because at first light, Yun went into that thorn break after a lamb, and came out of it with his thigh laid open to the muscle, and Tavis Cray had not yet packed his cart. They brought Yun down from the top field on a hurdle with a dog running alongside. I could hear the blood before I could see the boy, because it was hitting the wood in bursts. A blackthorn stub had gone into the outside of his right thigh, and he had pulled himself off it sideways. The wound was the length of my hand, and it was open to the muscle, and it was full of bark. The bleeding was wrong for a vein. It came in pushes, timed to something, and that meant a branch of the artery in the thigh had been opened. That meant the boy had about 10 minutes of choices left. Tavis Cray was in the mill yard with his cart half loaded. He put the saw across the tailgate, looked at the hurdle, and started rolling his sleeves before anybody had asked him a question. Mara was Yun's mother. She had 4 fingers on her left hand, and she was already saying, "Yes, take it high, just leave me the boy." She had watched this trade made before, and she knew the price. Tavis told her the truth as he understood it. He said a leg is a bad exchange for a son, but it is an exchange. That a wound with bark in it always goes yellow, and above the knee, it goes yellow fast. He was not lying. In his world, that is exactly what happens. Bark and dirt in a deep thigh wound, closed up or left open, no washing, no drainage. 4 days to the smell, and 7 to the grave. I got my hands on the boy first, not out of courage. There was a spurt on the wood, and my body moved before the rest of me had a vote, because that is what 8 years does to you. I put the heel of my right hand into the groin crease above the wound and leaned and found the pulse under it and pressed until the pushing stopped. It stopped in 1 second. That is all the trick amounts to. The yard went quiet. 60 people had watched a foot come off the day before without a word, and now they were staring at a stranger kneeling in the dirt with his hand jammed into a boy's groin. Tavis said, without heat, that I was holding a life shut with a hand that would tire in 4 minutes. He was right, and I told him I needed water boiled and a straight fire, and I needed it now. Then came the part I have replayed more than any other minute of those 12 years, because everything else grew out of it, and it was not a speech, it was a bet, made by a man out of options. I told Mara that if I could not save the leg was his and my body was hers. I said it in front of everybody in that yard. If the boy lost the leg or died, they could do what they liked with me. Tavis did not object. I understood why later. If the boy died under my hands, the guild lost 8 silver and gained a warning story. If the boy died under his, the mother would remember him forever. He let me have it because the arithmetic was in his favor either way. He sat down on his own cart to watch, with the crystal lenses pushed up on his head, and he told me the fire was already lit. Everything I had was this: my 2 hands, a brass pin out of Mara's shawl, 9 hairs pulled out of the mill horse's tail, a hollow wheat straw, a rope, a cook pot, well water. That was the whole kit. I sent Mara for the pot and told her to boil the water and keep it boiling while she counted to 300 out loud, that she was not to stop counting for any reason at all. She asked why 300. I said because I could not see whether it was clean and the counting was the only clock in the village. She counted. That count became a law in this world, and it started there. I put a rope tourniquet high on the thigh with a stick through it and turned it until the pushing stopped without my hand. Then I timed it, because nobody ever thinks about that part of a tourniquet. A leg with a rope on it is a leg you are killing slowly to save the boy attached to it. You get an hour at the very outside, and I intended to use less than that, and I told his mother the number out loud. The pin went in the pot. The horsehair went in the pot. The straw went in the pot. I put my own hands in the water as hot as I could stand and scrubbed to the elbow with lye soap off the mill shelf. Somebody laughed at that. A man behind me asked whether I was going to wash the boy as well, and I said yes. He laughed harder, and hold on to that laugh, because it lasted 12 years. Then I opened the wound wider. That is not a mistake. It is the job. A deep, dirty wound has to be laid open to its own floor, or you are just building a lid on a hole and hoping. I washed it with boiled water off a cooled ladle until the water came out of it clear instead of brown. 3 passes. 4. Bark came out. Grass came out. A gray pad of dead fat came out on my finger. And on the 5th pass, I found what would have killed him, a piece of the blackthorn stub as long as my thumb joint, sitting under the muscle where nobody looking at the wound from outside could ever see it. I held it up. It was black and wet and had bark on it. I said, loudly enough for the yard, that this was the thing that makes wounds rot, and that it had been inside him and out of sight. Mara stopped counting. I told her to keep counting. She kept counting. Behind me, Tavis stood up off the cart for the first time. He did not say anything, and he did not sit back down either. The bleeder was a branch off the deep artery, and it was small enough to tie. I put a hair around it twice and pulled it down and let the tourniquet off half a turn to check, and it held. Then I closed him, not all at once, and not tight, because that is how you make a sealed pocket. And a sealed pocket with anything living left in it will kill a boy faster than an open hole ever does. I closed the muscle sheath in 3 stitches with boiled hair and left the fat alone, and closed the skin with 4 and left a finger width of the lowest end of the wound open and not stitched at all. Into that gap, I slid the boiled wheat straw, half its length in, and tied it to the skin with a hair so it could not slide in further. That was the drain. There was no more technology in it than that. Pus that has a way out is a nuisance. Pus that has no way out goes looking for one, and it finds the bone or the blood, and then a man like Tavis has to take the leg. Give it a door, and the fight is mostly over. I counted his pulse the whole way through, out loud, because there was nothing else to measure, and because a boy who can hear a voice counting is a boy who is not alone on a hurdle. 90 at the start, 110 in the middle, which frightened me. 96 when I let the tourniquet all the way off, and no pushing, and I sat back on my heels in the dirt. 4 men had been holding him, his father's cousin, on the shoulders, 2 on the good leg, Mara on the head with a belt in his teeth. He screamed for most of it and then stopped screaming and just breathed. That is the other thing I want on the record from the very start. He felt every single second of it. I had nothing to give him. Not one thing. Remember that too, because it comes back and it takes a life. Total time from the first cut to the last stitch was less than the tourniquet allowed. The whole job used 1 pot of water, 1 pin, 9 hairs, 1 straw, and some soap. Cost in this world, at the going rate, of the other way, 8 silver, 1 crutch, a month of poppy draft, and a boy who cannot go up the top field after goats ever again. Cost of my way, nothing, not a coin. I could not have paid a coin, and that was the first time I understood what I was actually holding, and it was not a gift, and it was not magic. It was an entire trade that could be given away for free, in a place where the one thing it competed with cost 10 silver and half your body. There is no version of that which does not end in a fight. I put the boy in the mill loft where I could sit next to him, propped the leg up on a grain sack, and told Mara the 4 things to watch for: red spreading, smell, fever, him going quiet and gray. She asked what she should do if any of those happened, and I said, come and get me at any hour. If I am gone, take the leg off, and I said it because it was true, and because she needed a door too. That night, I checked the straw every 2 hours, and pressed a thumb beside the stitch line. The 3rd time I did it, a bead of yellow came up the straw and out, which is exactly what a drain is for. That was the minute I let myself believe it, not the stitches. A hollow piece of boiled wheat with a drop of pus coming out of it in a loft in a village whose name I had learned the day before. At dawn, Yun was warm and not hot, and he was hungry, and he asked whether the goats had got back in the break. I told him the goats were somebody else's problem for 6 weeks. Tavis Cray came up the loft ladder at first light. He did not come to threaten me. He came as an engineer comes to look at somebody else's bridge, and he asked to see the leg, and I let him. He crouched and looked at the wound for a long time. He touched the skin either side of the stitch line with 2 fingers, as a man checks heat. He looked at the straw, and he said one word: drain. He had a word for it. His guild had no procedure for it, no tool for it, no place for it in the charter, and somewhere in 200 limbs he had noticed the hole and the fluid and given it a name anyway. Then he asked me where I had seen a wound sewn shut like that. Not who taught me, where I had seen it. And I said I had seen a few thousand of them, and he took his lenses off and cleaned them. He told me he had seen one, once, on a table in the guild house in Marnhold, on a body they had opened up to teach apprentices, a sailor off a foreign ship who had died of something in his chest. There had been a healed cut across the man's belly, closed with a row of small, even stitches by hands he did not know, and no rot in it at all. The guild had argued about it for a week, and shelved it. He said it in the flat voice men use when they are moving one stone in a wall they have lived behind their whole lives. Then he stood up and looked at me, and he was not friendly anymore. He said, I have seen a stitch like yours exactly once, and it was in a dead man. This village will want to know how a stranger with no cart and no charter came to have the hands of a corpse. He went down the ladder. I heard his cart go out of the yard within the hour, and he did not go west to the next valley on his round. He went east towards the chapel at Ashwater, where the priests keep records. 6 days later, Yun stood up on both legs and walked the length of the mill yard with a stick, in front of about 40 people, and that is when the trouble actually started. He did it with a drain already out and a dry pink line where the wound had been, and 40 people watched him do it, and nobody cheered. I had braced for the wrong thing. I had spent 6 nights expecting fever and gangrene, and what actually arrived was 40 people standing very still, working out what they had just been shown. Because, in Ordain, that boy was supposed to have 1 leg. Not probably. Certainly. Every adult in that yard had watched a bark-filled wound above the knee go yellow and then go into the ground. They had seen it dozens of times, at every harvest, for their whole lives. It is the most reliable fact in their world, and I had just broken it in public, in the middle of the village, for free. When something that's certain stops being true, people do not conclude that they were wrong. They conclude that a swap has been made. Something was put in the boy's place. Somebody paid for it. That is not stupidity either. Given everything they knew, it was the only conclusion left standing. And once you decide a swap happened, the next question is who is going to be charged for it. The evidence went into the record in front of the chapel over the following 2 weeks. It is worth walking through, because every single item on the list was something I had actually done. 1. He boiled water with things in it, true. Lye soap off the mill shelf, and on the 3rd day, a splash of the miller's grain spirit that I begged off him to clean the pin, because it was all I had. 2. He whispered over the open wound and did not stop. True. I was counting the boy's pulse out loud because there was nothing else in that village to measure with, and I never once explained why. 3. He cut hair from Burn's horse in the night. True. 9 hairs from the tail, and I did not ask, because a boy was pumping blood onto a hurdle and Burn was up at the top field. 4. He carried a curved pin and a flask and a hollow straw and no tools of any recognized trade. True. That was my whole kit, and to a village, it looked exactly like the kit of somebody else. 5. He offered to do it for nothing. True, and this was the worst of them all. Nothing in Ordain is free, so a man who charges nothing is being paid by somebody you cannot see. Tavis Cray came back on the 14th day with a guild writ and a reader of the chapel from Ashwater. He did not shout, and he did not gloat, and he built a case that was better than mine. He stood in front of the village and said he had taken a little over 200 limbs in his working life. He said it slowly, because it was his authority and his cost, and he had earned the right. Then he said that in 200, not once, never, had a deep thigh wound with bark in it healed on the leg. Not with prayer, not with pitch, not with poppy, not with the best hands in 6 valleys. Therefore, he said, this did not happen the way we were told it happened. Something else did it. And he asked the village to name for him one honest trade in Ordain in which the master works for free. That is a good argument. I want to be fair to him. If you know nothing about infection, and a stranger with a corpse's stitching arrives out of a field and refuses payment, he is the likeliest thing in the room. Then it was my turn, and I lost the whole village in about 90 seconds, and I did not lose it by lying to them. I lost it by telling them the truth, in order, exactly as it is. I told them about the living things. I said dirt and hands and old thread carry things too small to see, that they get into the meat and multiply there, that the yellow is them and the dead flesh together. I said the boiling kills them, and washing takes them out, and the drain gives the ones you missed a road to leave by. That is the whole of it, and there is nothing else in it at all. A woman near the front asked me a completely reasonable question, in a completely reasonable voice, with her hands folded. She asked me to show her one of them, just one, any size, any way I liked. I could not. Not one. I have no glass, no lens ground fine enough, no way in that village or that century to put a single one of them in front of a single pair of eyes. I stood in front of 60 people and said, in effect, that the world is full of invisible animals which only I can know about, that they should therefore stop trusting the trade that had served them for centuries. I have thought about that afternoon for 12 years. That was the day the 5 rules of clean hands were born, and not one word of them mentions anything invisible. And that is the only reason they work. Brother Halm did not argue for me, and he did not argue against me. What he did do, when I pushed him, was agree to a test. I still think it was brave, and I think it cost him more than the exile cost me. There was a man in that village called Osgar with a hole in his shin that had been draining for 7 years, bone infection. In my world, that is months of work, and sometimes it beats you anyway. I asked Halm to do to Osgar's leg exactly what he had done to the woman's foot. Close it with the light, in front of everybody, and then let the village look at it every day for a week. He did it. It took him about a minute and it was real, and I need to say clearly that I have never once doubted that the light is real. The edges of that hole came together and sealed, and the skin went smooth. Osgar wept. His wife wept. 2 days later, the shin was hot and tight and swollen to the knee. On the 4th day, it burst open through the new skin and let out what had been shut in with it. The light closes the tear. It does not touch what is already living underneath. It never has. And Halm knew that because he told me afterwards, quietly, by the chapel wall, in one sentence I never forgot. He said, we close them and about half die, and the ones who die are the ones who were already rotten. We write down the will of the light because there is nothing else to write. Then he said the thing that finished me. He said if he stood up and called what I did a miracle, he would be telling this village that a miracle had come from somewhere other than the light. He could not do it, and it was not cowardice. He did not know what else it could be. The only 2 words available to him were miracle and witchcraft, and one of those was blasphemy. So they voted. It was not a mob, and there was no torchlight. They voted in the morning with the sun out, and the vote was for the fire, and the vote was carried by about 2/3. Mara saved my life, and she did it with the only argument that has ever moved a room in this world, which is a fact that everybody present can see standing on 2 legs. She got up with Yun holding her sleeve, and she said, my son has a leg. She said it 3 times. Then she said the sentence that was the first time anybody in Ordain used my name as a name. She said, Mark Hale washed my son's leg with boiled water, and he did not take a coin for it. If you burn him, you will have to explain to every mother here what you burned him for. Nobody in that chapel could answer that, because there was a boy standing in it, so they changed the sentence. Exile instead of the fire, out of the valley by sundown, and never on this road again. They took what I had, which was nothing, and they took the mill loft, which was not mine. Then they walked me to the top of the lane, and somewhere in the last 30 steps, the stones started. Most of them missed. One did not. It opened my left eyebrow, and I finished the walk with blood in that eye. I remember being annoyed in a very specific professional way about the dirt on the stone. I washed the cut at the trough at the top of the lane with water I had no way to boil. I held it shut with a strip of my own shirt, and it healed crooked, and it is still crooked. Tavis Cray was at the top of the lane with his cart. He had won completely, and he did not look like a man who had won. He looked like a man who had a splinter in his thumb and could not find it. So I asked him for the saw, not the case, not the knives, not the tourniquet. The saw, the one I had watched go through a woman's shin bone in 11 strokes while her mother held the bowl. He asked me what for. He was genuinely thrown. A condemned man walking out with nothing had just asked a guild master for the single most expensive item on his cart and asked politely. I told him that the boy's leg was worth 8 silver, plus a crutch, plus a month of poppy at his own published rate, that I had done the job and that he could pay me in kind. He laughed. It was the first honest laugh I had heard from him. He said that a man who leaves a village carrying a bone setter saw is telling every village after this one exactly what he is. I said good. He asked what I would do with it, and I told him the truth, because I had nothing to lose in that lane and because I wanted him to carry it, and he did carry it for 17 years. I told him that one day I was going to hang it on a wall with a line written under it, that people would walk past it on their way to work and not understand why it was there. He took the saw out of the case and gave it to me in a wrap of oiled cloth. He said we would see each other again, and neither of us understood at the time how right he was about that. Yun came up the lane after me with bread and the walking stick he had cut himself. He was limping, and he was not supposed to be out of bed, and his mother let him go anyway. He asked me where I was going. I did not have an answer, so I asked him the only useful question I could think of, which was who lives on the other side of the pass. He said giants. He said it the way you say wolves. 3.5 meters, stone skin, they come down twice a year to trade, and nobody cheats them. And then he said, the thing that decided the next 12 years. The priests do not go up there, he said, because giants are cursed, because the light will not take on them. He said a giant with an open wound just fills it with pitch and waits to see what happens. I stood in the lane with a stolen saw, a brass pin, a heel of bread, and a boy's stick. I did the arithmetic one more time, and the arithmetic said go where nobody holds a charter. Tally, at the top of that lane, on the 39th day of my second life. Patients treated, 1. Students, none. Clean houses, none. Names I had lost, none. And I was stupid enough at that point to think that was going to hold. I walked up towards the pass with blood drying in one eye. Behind me, the village went back to work, and Osgar's shin went on draining. The woman with the missing foot learned to use her crutch. It took me 3 days to get over the pass, and on the second night, I sat above the tree line and watched 4 giants with torches burn a spider nest out of a cliff face, and I thought nothing of it at all. That is worth saying now. The thing that made everything possible was on fire 200 paces away from me. I looked at it, and I ate the last of Yun's bread, and I went to sleep. The cold nearly finished me. I had 1 shirt, a stolen saw, and a brass pin. On the 3rd morning, I could not feel 3 of my toes, and I sat and worked them with my hands for an hour before they came back. Then the ground went down and the wind dropped, and I came out above a settlement built of dry stone, with doorways I could have walked through without ducking if I had been standing on my own shoulders. Stone step. 40-odd houses. A stream turned into a stone channel, drying racks the size of barn roofs. People 3.5 meters tall, moving around it doing ordinary morning work. Their skin is gray and it has the texture of dressed stone, and it is not armor, whatever the stories say. It splits, it bleeds, and it rots exactly like mine, only slower and on a much bigger scale. I did not sneak in. I have thought about this a lot, and I still think it was the right call, although at the time it was mostly that I could not run and had nowhere to run to. I walked down the track in the open with my hands out and the oiled cloth held up over my head, and a hunting party came up on me from the side so fast I did not hear them until they were on me. A hand went round my chest and lifted me off the ground, and my ribs creaked. It was a young giantess called Halda, and she held me out at arm's length like a farmer holding a rat, and asked what I was. I said doctor. That word did not exist in Ordain. So I said bone setter, and the whole party went still. That was the first time I understood that the guild's reputation had crossed the pass ahead of me. They took me to Dorn Stoneshoulder, elder of Stonestep, who was sitting on a slab outside the longhouse with a wooden tally board across his knees, cutting a notch into it with a knife. He was old. His hair was white, and his left shoulder sat wrong, dropped and forward. He moved his head instead of his arm when he wanted to look sideways, which told me most of his life story. I opened the oiled cloth on the slab in front of him. The saw sat there on the gray stone in the morning sun. Every giant in that yard knew exactly what it was and what it was for. Dorn put one finger on the blade. He said, "We have an axe." He nodded up at the longhouse door, where an axe with a head the size of my chest was leaning against the frame, and it was not for wood. Then he asked me whether I had walked over the pass in one shirt to sell him a better one. He asked it without any interest in the answer, the way you ask a peddler before you send him off. So I did the only thing I could do, which was the thing I do. I did it out loud and fast because I had about 1 minute before somebody carried me back to the pass. I said, "The man behind you on the left has an abscess in his palm, at the base of the thumb. It has been there about a week, and his hand is hot, and he has stopped closing his fist." I said, "The woman by the drying rack broke her forearm, and it was never set, and it healed with a bend in it. She cannot turn her palm upward anymore, and she compensates with her shoulder." I said, "The young one at the channel has a tooth going bad on the lower right, and he is chewing on the other side. If it gets into the bone of his jaw, nothing anybody in this valley can do will stop it." I said, "The man sitting down has pitch over a wound on his thigh, and it is not healing under there. If somebody presses either side of the pitch, pus will come out at the edge, and he already knows it will." Nobody spoke. Halda put me down on the ground. Dorn Stoneshoulder looked at me for a long moment. Then he pulled his own left arm across his chest with his right hand, and he asked me about the shoulder. I asked him to move it 3 ways, and I watched. Then I told him the truth, which is that his shoulder had come out of the socket a long time ago, probably 30 years, and had never been put back in. I told him that if he had come to me the same day, I could have had it back in the socket in about a minute with his own weight and my hands, that now it was too late by 3 decades and it would stay as it was. He did not thank me. What he did was better. He turned the tally board around on his knees and let me look at the notches. There were more than 100 of them in rows, cut over years in 3 different sizes. He kept the count of his dead. It is the entire reason I lived past that morning, and it had nothing to do with kindness or curiosity or prophecy. It was an old man who wrote things down. He read it out for me. In 14 years, in a village of about 271 dead of wounds that did not kill them on the day. 34 limbs taken off with the axe by his own hand. Then he told me how it goes here, and this is the part that turned my stomach worse than the square in Low Hollow, because it is bigger and it happens on a schedule. Once a month, sometimes twice, things come down from the southern spurs. He called them the spur beasts, and I never got a straight description because every giant described them differently. The giants win. They almost always win. That is the point. They are 3.5 meters of muscle with stone over the top, and they have been doing this for centuries, and they are very good at it. And then they come home with tooth wounds and claw wounds and crushed hands. They pack the wounds with hot pitch to close them. And over the next 5 weeks, they rot from their own victories. Pitch does exactly the wrong thing. It is a perfect seal. It holds the dirt and the dead tissue and the tooth filth inside a warm, closed pocket and gives it nowhere to go but into the giant. So the wound goes bad under the pitch. The arm swells to the shoulder. Then Dorn Stoneshoulder takes the axe off the doorframe. The village holds their friend down, and about half of them live. Except that for a giant, surviving the axe is not the same as surviving. He explained this to me very carefully because he thought I was too small to understand the mechanics of a giant's life. A giant needs about 7 times what I need to eat. You cannot hunt a spur beast with one arm. You cannot pull a drying rack, you cannot carry a carcass, you cannot hold a spear with both hands. A one-armed giant in Stone Step eats out of other people's kills for the rest of his life and knows it every single day. He showed me one, a man called Bren, who sat by the channel and did not look up. So there is the exchange rate. The axe buys you the rest of your life as a mouth, and they all know it, and they still hold their friends down for it, because the alternative that they know of is death. I asked about the priests. Dorn said one came a long time ago, and I got the rest from Halda later because Dorn stopped talking about it and started cutting a new notch. A priest of the light came up over that pass about 20 years back with 2 guards and good intentions and tried to close a wound on the ribs of a giant called Orman. He held the light on it for a long time and got about the length of a hand closed out of a tear, as long as my whole arm. Then he could not stand up. Then he tried again the next day and closed a little less. Orman died. The priest went back down the pass and told the truth as it looked to him, which was that the light would not take on giants. The church wrote it into doctrine as a curse. That is where the cursed races come from, not malice, body mass. A priest's power is enough to close a man and nowhere near enough to close 3.5 meters of anything, and nobody ever measured why. So Stone Step has been told for 20 years by the only people in Ordain who can genuinely heal a wound that the reason they cannot be healed is that something is wrong with what they are. Dorn gave me a test job first, and I have never been so grateful for a hand abscess in my life. He pointed at the man with the hot palm, whose name was An, and he said, "That one, today, and we watch." An's hand was the size of a shovel, and the abscess under the base of his thumb was the size of my fist, and it was as tight as a drum, and he could not bend the joint at all. I borrowed a skinning knife, the smallest thing in the village, which was still about the length of my forearm. I put it in a pot of boiling water while I scrubbed to the elbow with their soap. Their soap is good, ash and rendered fat, made in a stone trough, better than what I had in the mill at Low Hollow. Nobody in Ordain lacks soap. They just do not point it at a wound. I made An sit on the ground and put his hand flat on a stone, and I told Halda to hold the wrist. I told An that the next 10 seconds would be the worst part, and then it would stop hurting. Then I opened the abscess along the crease, not across it. About 2 cups of pus came out onto the stone, and An made a noise like a door, and then said in a completely different voice, "Oh, I have chased that sound for 12 years. It is not gratitude. It is a man finding out that the thing he has been carrying can be put down." I washed the cavity out until it ran clean. Then I packed the cavity open with boiled cloth instead of closing it, which is the opposite of everything they know. I told An that a hole that stays open heals, and a hole that is sealed kills. Next morning, An closed his fist. 2 days after that, he was on the racks lifting with both hands. That was my second patient in Ordain, and my third and fourth were a tooth and a split fingertip. 4 patients. No coin, no charter, no thread, but boiled sinew. 1 small stone building with a fire in it that Dorn let me sleep in because it was easier than deciding what else to do with me. Then I asked for the worst one in the village. The whole long house went quiet again, and Halda took me up the slope to where a giantess was sitting on her own with her back to the settlement. Garda was a hunter. She had been the best in Stone Step, and everybody said so in the past tense. Her right arm was gone at the shoulder, taken with the axe a year before, and the stump was clean and old. Her left forearm had a cut across the inside of it from a spur beast's tooth, 12 days old, packed with pitch by her own hand. The pitch had lifted at one edge, her fingers were swollen and would not straighten. There was a red line running up the inside of her arm past the elbow. When I got within 2 paces, the smell told me the rest. I have smelled that smell in a hospital, and I have never got used to it. She would not look at me. She told me to go away in a voice that was completely level, and then she told me why. It took her 1 sentence, and it stopped me where I stood. She said, "They will bring the axe in 4 days. I cannot live off other people's kills with no arms at all, so on the 3rd night I am going up into the spurs on my own, and I am not coming back." She had it planned. The night, the direction, the reason. She had worked out the arithmetic of her own life as Dorn worked out his notches, and there was no self-pity anywhere in it. I told her I could keep the arm. She asked me if I had ever kept one. I said yes, hundreds. She asked me if I had ever kept a giant's arm, and I had to say no, and she nodded and looked back at the mountains. What changed her mind was not hope. It was that she was already dead in her own accounting, so the cost of letting me try was 0. She said exactly that, and she said it as an argument. Dorn came up the slope with the tally board still under his arm, and he set the terms in front of both of us. There was nothing warm in it, and I've never respected a decision more. He said I could work on 1. This one, not 2. And he said, if she dies of what you do to her, we bury you in the same ground on the same day. I will cut 2 notches, and one of them will be yours. I opened Garda's forearm on the 57th day of my second life, in a stone shed with the door taken off for light. I got the infection out of her in about 2 hours, and then I lost to a piece of string. Not to the rot. Not to the priests, not to the guild, not to a beast off the spurs. To thread. 3 times in a row, over 19 days, while the red line went up her arm at about a finger's width every 2 days. The job itself was this. Her forearm is longer than my leg. The muscle on it is thicker than my thigh. The cut ran across the inside of it, and the pitch had turned the whole channel into a warm pocket. I laid it open along its length, which meant a cut in a giant as long as my arm, and I washed it with boiled water off a cooled ladle. I did that for 2 hours, and the state of it was as bad as anything I saw in the first year. There was dead muscle in there in sheets. There was a tooth fragment the size of my thumbnail. There was a plug of pitch driven in under the muscle belly, and the smell when I lifted that out cleared the shed. 4 giants held her. Halda on the shoulder, on the elbow with both hands, 2 more on the body, and a folded hide between her teeth. She did not scream once, and that was worse than screaming. I had nothing to give her. I need to keep saying that because it is the true shape of that fortnight. I cut a woman open for 2 hours with her awake and looking at the ceiling and counting the roof stones. By the end, the wound bled red and clean at the edges. The fever came down that night by a real amount. Dorn came in the morning, put his hand on her forehead and his hand on her chest, and cut no notch. That is the only reason I got a second attempt, and a third. Not faith. A cooler forehead, measured by an old man with a tally board who had felt about 70 foreheads go the other way. Then I closed it, and that is where the 19 days went. Cleaning that arm was 1 afternoon of hard work. Holding it shut afterwards was 3 separate failures with 3 separate materials. Attempt 1. Boiled horsehair, the same material that had held a boy's thigh together 6 weeks earlier. I put in about 50 stitches in 2 layers, and it looked good, and I slept for 4 hours. At dawn, her arm was open again from the elbow to the wrist. Not infected, not swollen, just open, with the horsehair lying in loops in the wound bed, and 19 of the loops snapped clean through. I sat on the floor of that shed and worked out the arithmetic I should have worked out before I picked up the needle. It is simple, and I had been on this world for 8 weeks, and I had not thought about it once. A stitch holds 2 wound edges against the pull of the flesh around them. In a man, that pull is a couple of kilos, and a horsehair takes a couple of kilos, and that is why horsehair has ever worked. Garda flexed her fingers in her sleep. Her forearm muscles are the size of a rolled hide. When they pulled with the strength of an animal that kills things with claws by holding them still. Every single stitch in that arm was being asked to hold about the load of a man hanging off a rope. 40 stitches or 400, it does not matter. They fail one after another, and then the whole line goes. Attempt 2. Braided flax cord off the drying racks, thick as a bootlace, the same stuff they use to hang half a carcass. That did not snap. Not one strand of it snapped. It cut through her instead. A cord that will not break will always find the softer thing in the joint, and the softer thing was the wound edge. By the second morning, every stitch had sawn its own slot in her flesh. So I had made the wound bigger with the thing that was supposed to hold it shut. There were 50 small new injuries down each side of it, and each of those slots was a place where rot could start. Attempt 3, dried sinew, which is what they use for bowstrings, and which is enormously strong. That was the worst of the 3, and it was the one that nearly killed her, and it was my fault. Sinew does not stretch. An arm after surgery swells for 2 days. When the arm swelled, the stitches did not give, so the tissue under each stitch had its blood supply strangled and went gray and then black. I took every one of them out on the second evening with her arm across a stone block and no way to dull any of it. By then, there were 19 small dead patches to cut away as well. That was the night Garda asked me to stop. She did not ask like a coward. She said it flat in the dark after the others had gone. She asked me to use the smallest knife on her throat instead. She said she had been cut open by me 3 times, and she had counted the roof stones 20 times over, and she could not do a fourth. She said the arm was not worth what I was doing to her to keep it. I told her no. I have thought about whether I had the right to say no, and I do not have a clean answer. What I said was that I had not run out of ideas, only out of string, and that string is a thing you can go and get. She laughed. It was the first sound out of her that was not pain, and it was a bad laugh. She said that if I found string in a mountain, she would carry me on her shoulder for a year. She did eventually, not for a year, for about 14 months, off and on, all over that range, because it turned out to be faster than walking. That belongs on the record, because she never let me forget it. Then, I did the least dramatic and most important thing I did in my first year, which was to sit in a stone shed with everything in stone step that could be called a fiber and test it properly. Flax cord, flax thread, hemp twine, dried sinew, 3 thicknesses, gut from the beasts, horsehair, goat hair, bark fiber from the trees below the tree line, braided grass, a strip of hide cut thin. I hung stones off them, that is all. A loop over a roof beam, a basket underneath, and I put stones in the basket one at a time until the loop failed. I made Halda count the stones out loud for me. Then I wet each of them and did it again, because a wound is wet, and half of the good results collapsed. Bark fiber held 13 stones dry and 4 wet. Braided grass held 8 dry and 2 wet. And then the third test, which nobody in Ordain had any reason to invent, because it is the test that only matters if you intend to put the thing inside a person and leave it there. I asked how much each one stretched before it failed, and I marked the loops with charcoal to measure it. Every strong thing on that list stretched by almost nothing at all. There was the problem, written down in one line. I needed a thread that took the load of a man hanging off it, that stretched instead of cutting, that did not rot in wet flesh, and that was thin enough to knot. Nothing in that village came close, and the village had been building drying racks and bowstrings and hide boats for 400 years, so nothing anywhere on that mountain came close either. Except that I had watched 4 giants stand on a cliff and burn a bank of the exact material I was describing. I had eaten bread while they did it, and it took me 12 days to remember it. Halda told me the rest when I asked. They burn the nests twice a year. The weavers take goats and sometimes take a child, and a nest above a settlement is a thing you burn on principle and always have. The mountain weavers, she called them, bodies the size of a dog, legs that make them a good deal wider than that, gray and brown, quiet, and they build in the dry caves along the cliff bands. I asked her to take me up. She refused, and she was not embarrassed about refusing. She said she had helped burn that nest in the spring, and she was not going back to a burned nest on foot with a stranger. She gave me a torch, a pitch pot, and the smallest spear in the village, which was taller than I am. Then she told me to be back before dark and went to sit with Garda, and she did not think I would come back. The climb took most of the afternoon. The cliff band is a series of dry overhangs with cave mouths under them. The burned nest was the third one along, and the burn was months old, and everything in it was ash. The 4th cave along the band had not been burned at all. The mouth of it was lower, and it faced away from the settlement. I had to go in on my hands and knees for the first 8 or 10 paces. I want to be accurate about what I found, because for years afterwards, people told this part as though something spoke to me in there, and nothing spoke to me in there, and there was no light in it but mine. There were sheets of web across the back of the cave, layered in a rough dome shape, anchored to the rock. Not the flat rounds you get in a garden, it was structural, and it had been built by more than one animal. The first thing I noticed was that it was clean. There was no rot smell, no mold, nothing growing on it. There were dry husks of beetles in it that had clearly been there for a long time without decaying. The second thing I noticed was when I put my hand into a strand and pulled. I got a single line between both fists, and I put my whole weight on it and leaned back until my feet came off the floor. It stretched. It came out like a drawn wire, and it went thinner, and it did not part. When I let it go, it went most of the way back, and I stood in a cave in a mountain and started laughing. Load, yes. Stretch, yes. No rot in it, yes. And I had a whole husk of a beetle in my hand as the evidence for that. And it was thin. It was thinner than the horsehair I had already sewn a boy's thigh with. I wound a hank around my forearm off the driest sheet, working from the front of the cave inward. I took maybe 2 arms lengths of it, which turned out to be about enough for one giant. Then I turned round with the torch in my hand to go home. I stopped because the light only went about 4 paces, and the owner of that nest was standing at the edge of it. Body the size of a dog, exactly as Halda had said, front legs up off the ground and folded, absolutely still, close enough that I could see the light moving on it and see it was not going to let me past. And then, out beyond the edge of my torchlight, low down along the cave floor, 3 more of them shifted their weight at the same time. Nothing in the story of my life is stupider than the fact that I got out of that cave by dropping the torch. I only worked out afterwards that the torch was the entire reason they had come at me. I did not fight 4 mountain weavers with a spear I could barely lift. I put the spear down on the floor, which took me about a minute of moving 1 finger at a time, and then I stood still and thought. They had not moved while I was winding silk off the outer sheets. They came out when I turned round, and what turned round with me was a burning torch. Their whole species has one enemy in these mountains. Giants with fire, twice a year for as long as any of them have been alive. Every nest on that cliff band that faced the settlement was ash, and the one that survived was the one facing away. So I put the torch head down against the wet rock and killed it. I stood in the black with my hank of silk on my forearm and did not move for a very long count, and something walked past my boot. Then I crawled out on my hands and knees, and the mountain took its payment for that. I opened both palms and my right knee on the rock, and I came down the cliff band in the dark, bleeding. Halda found me on the track below the tree line. She had come up with 2 others to look for the body, which she told me cheerfully. She carried me back to Stone Step upside down under one arm. And then I did the single most useful thing of the whole night, which was to boil water in a stone shed at midnight and wash my own knee out properly and leave it open in front of 7 giants who watched me do it. They had seen me do it to An's hand and to Garda's arm. They had not seen me do it to myself. It is a very small thing, and it moved that village further than anything I said in 5 weeks. In the morning I ran the tests. Same roof beam, same basket, same stones, and Halda counting out loud because her counting had become a sort of joke by then, and jokes are how you get people to keep records. Dry, it took 33 stones before the loop failed. Wet, it took 31. Everything else in that village had lost half its strength wet. This lost almost nothing, and I made Halda repeat that count twice. Then the stretch, marked with charcoal, measured against a scratch on the beam. It came out about a third longer under load, and it went most of the way back afterwards, and it did that over and over. Third test, the one that mattered. I put a length of it in a bowl of water with a piece of raw meat, in the corner of the shed, in the warm. I left it there for 6 days, and I looked at it every morning. The meat rotted. Of course it did. The silk sitting in the same bowl of rotten water came out as clean as it went in. I could still not break it, and nothing had grown along it at all. Those 3 things are why it works, and nothing else about it matters. It carries the load of a giant's muscle. It gives when the arm swells instead of strangling it, and rot does not live on it. I did not know the 4th thing yet. The 4th thing is the one that changed the future. I found it out 2 weeks later by accident, and the order it arrived in matters. We opened Garda's arm for the 4th time on the 78th day. She did not argue. What she said, while Halda tied the hide strap around her upper arm, was, "Count them out loud so I know where you are." So I did. Not the pulse this time. The stitches. I counted every single one out loud as I put it in. She lay there with her eyes on the roof and answered the numbers back to me, and that is how we got through it. The wound had to be freshened again, because I had cut and stitched and unpicked the same arm 3 times in 19 days. The edges were a mess of old slots and dead margins that all had to come off. Boiling water counted to 300 by on at the fire. Hands and forearms scrubbed with their ash soap before, after, and again after I touched anything that was not the wound. I washed the whole channel out until it ran clear, 3 passes. There was almost nothing left to take out this time, because the fever had already been down for 19 days, and her own body had done the rest. Drain first, a hollow section of bird bone, boiled, tied to the skin at the low end of the wound with a strand of silk so it could not go anywhere, and left standing proud of the skin by a thumb's width. Then the closure, in 2 layers. The deep layer holds the muscle sheath together and takes all the load. The skin layer just keeps the edges together and takes almost none, and mixing those 2 jobs is how people die. 22 in the deep layer, 29 in the skin, 51 stitches in 1 forearm, which tells you something about the size of the animal I was working on, and every one of them held when she flexed. I did not close the last thumb's width of it at the low end. That is not laziness. Pus must be given a way out, and a wound with a road out of it is a wound that argues with you instead of one that kills you. That night, I sat on the floor and did not sleep, and pressed a finger beside the stitch line every hour. Warm, not hot. In the morning, there was a bead of yellow at the bone drain, and nothing else. Day 3, the arm swelled as arms do, and I watched the silk take up the slack instead of cutting in. I sat on the floor of that shed and had a very small private moment about it. Day 6, she moved her fingers, all 4 and the thumb. She said it did not feel like her hand yet, and I told her it would not for a month. It took about 6 weeks, and she was working the racks before that month was out. Day 12, she closed her fist around the handle of a water pail and lifted it, one-armed, with the arm that Dorn Stoneshoulder had been going to take off with an axe on the 60th day. Day 14. I boiled a knife and a pair of pincers and went in to take the stitches out and knelt down beside her arm, and there were no stitches in it to take out. I could see where they had been. 51 little marks in 2 rows down the inside of her forearm and a straight healed line between them. The knots had gone soft and flat, and most of them had simply gone. I picked at one, and it came away as a thread of nothing between my fingers. I went and got the length I had left in the rotten water bowl. That one was fine, and I stood there working out the difference. Water does not eat it. A living body does. Somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks inside living flesh, it goes. It goes without leaving a lump and without leaving a track for anything to crawl in along. I want to explain why I sat down on a stone floor when I understood that, because it does not sound like the important part, and it is the most important part of the first year by a long way. Taking stitches out of a person is a job. It hurts, it takes time, and it requires the patient to come back and hold still and let a man with a blade go at a healed wound with tweezers. Now picture doing that to a giant. 51 stitches in a hunter with a hand the size of a chair who has been cut open 4 times and who is frightened of the needle in a way she will never say out loud. Picture doing it in a village 3 days over a pass. Picture doing it 30 times a month. Picture teaching somebody else to do it. The whole thing collapses. Every part of it collapses at the removal step. Silk that dissolves means the operation ends when I put the last knot in. It means a wound in a valley I will never visit again closes itself and the thread disappears and nobody has to come back. That is not a small convenience. That is the difference between one man treating a village and a school treating a continent. It was sitting in a cave on a cliff band that giants had been burning for 400 years. Dorn Stoneshoulder came in on the 15th day when Garda was outside carrying water with the arm and about 30 people were pretending not to watch her do it. He looked at the arm for a long time. He turned it over. He made her open and close the fist. Then he took the tally board out from under his arm, and he did not cut anything into it. And he showed me why. He said, "There is no notch for this." He said the board has a mark for dead and a mark for cut off and nothing else, because in 400 years, nobody in Stone Step has ever needed a third mark. Then he said, "So I will have to start a new row," and he asked me what to call it. I said, "Kept," and he cut the first notch of that row into the wood while I stood there. And then he said my name, and I need to put that in properly, because in this world, a name is a license, and I had not been given one since I arrived. He had called me the small one for 5 weeks, and every giant in that village had, and it was not an insult, it was a description. He put the knife away and said, "Mark Hale," and then he said the rest of it. He said, "You can work in this village for as long as you want to work in it. You can have the shed and the fire and food out of the common kill, and nobody here will lay a hand on you again." Then he said the last part in front of half a dozen people. It is the sentence I would have taken over any title anybody ever offered me afterwards, and I heard it from a man with a wooden board. He said, "I have cut 34 limbs off my own people with that axe. If you had come over the past 20 years ago, I would have cut fewer, and I am too old to pretend I am glad you are here." Garda came in with the empty pail and put it down and said her piece as well, in front of Dorn, in the tone of a woman closing a contract. She said she owed me 1 year, and she intended to pay it in carrying. She carried me for most of 14 months after that, up and down that range, from valley to valley, at about 3 times my walking speed, and she never once let me forget the terms. By the end of the 90th day, the count stood at 12 patients in Ordain, 1 boy's thigh in Low Hollow, 1 hand, 1 tooth, 1 fingertip, 1 forearm in Stone Step, and 7 more in the fortnight after Garda stood up. No students, no houses, no names in any ledger, because I had not lost anybody yet. I had one hank of mountain weaver silk left, enough for maybe one more arm the size of Garda's. I came out of the shed on the morning of the 91st day to go and boil water. There were 11 giants sitting on the ground outside my door in a line, in the order they had arrived. Between the 91st day and the 150th, I treated 42 patients and 61 separate wounds. 3 of them died, and I will give you those 3 names before I give you the numbers. Vern, Scylla, Bo. I wrote them on the flat side of a roof slate with a charcoal stick on the 141st day. That slate is in a glass case in the school at Kettle now, and I hate that it is. Start with the 2 months, because the 2 months are the reason the rest of this happened. And there was nothing clever in them at all. There was one man, a stone shed, and a queue that never got shorter. 11 giants on the first morning. I could treat one arm the size of Garda's with the silk I had, so I did the only honest thing available, which was to look at all 11 of them before I touched any of them. That took about an hour, and it is the hour this empire came out of. I went down the line, looked at every wound, pressed the skin around every one, and asked every one of them the same 4 questions. How many days? Did anything go into it and stay in? Can you feel your fingers or your toes? Has the redness moved since yesterday? And if it has, show me on your own arm where it was. Then I put them in an order, and the order had nothing to do with who they were. That is where all my future political trouble started, and I did not notice it happening at the time. The man at the front of the queue was a hunter with a 9-day-old claw wound over the shoulder blade and a red band already at his neck. He was going to be dead in a week, and he did not know it. The man at the back was Bren, the one armed one from the water channel, with a shallow cut across the back of his remaining hand. 2 days old, clean, nothing in it. 10 minutes of work at most. I took the shoulder first and Bren last, and I said out loud why, and nobody in that line objected. I filed that away as a thing that had gone easily and would go on going easily. It did not. I ran out of silk on the 4th patient, so I went back up the cliff band, and this time I went in the daylight with no fire at all. I found out something that turned into an industry. Without a torch, they do not come out. I sat at the mouth of that 4th cave for a long while with nothing burning. 2 of them crossed the floor at the back, and neither of them came within 4 paces of me. Then I worked out where to cut. The outer sheets are old and dry and no longer holding anything up. The core, at the back, is where the young are, and that is what they defend, and I never touched it. I took 2 arms lengths off the outer sheets and walked out, and 13 days later, I did it again. The sheets had been rebuilt, because that is what the animals do all day, and they had never had a customer before. The 3rd time I went, Halda came with me. She stood at the cave mouth with her hands empty because I asked her to leave the spear behind. She came out shaking and said she would do it again. By the end of the 2 months, there were 4 giants in Stone Step who would climb that band and cut silk without fire. The cliff had gone from a thing you burn in the spring to a thing you visit on a rota. It was the first time I saw the pattern that runs through everything afterwards. I did not invent the silk. It had been hanging in a cave for 400 years while people carried torches up to it. Now the 2 months themselves. 61 wounds. 4 abscesses opened and packed, including one in a giant's jaw that had eaten into the bone and cost him 3 teeth I could not save. 2 fractures set. Both forearms, both fresh, both straightforward, and setting a fresh forearm is easy, and setting one that healed crooked 9 years ago is not, and I could not do the second. 19 wounds that were only ever going to need washing, opening, draining, and closing. That would every single one of them have gone to the axe inside a month, and that is the boring bulk of the work. I slept about 3 hours a night. I ate standing up. My hands went first. And this is the part I never expected and should have, because I have watched surgeons' hands go for 8 years. Lye soap, boiling water, 40 times a day. By the 5th week, the skin across the backs of my fingers had split into cracks I could put a fingernail into. 2 of them on my right hand went red and hot. I had to treat myself, with people watching, because by then there were always people watching. I opened one of the cracks properly with a boiled blade, washed it out, packed it, and could not use the hand for 2 days. On ran the boiling shed for those 2 days, and Halda opened an abscess on a child's ankle, with me sitting on the floor beside her, telling her where the crease was, and she did it correctly. That was not a plan. That was a man with a bad hand who had a patient in front of him. But I saw a giantess do a clean drainage with her own hands, and after that, I could not unsee it. Then, on the 139th day, in the dark of the month, The spur beasts came down the stream channel into Stone Step. I found out what this village actually pays every 4 weeks. I had been told about it a dozen times, and I had not understood any of it. They come at night, in the dark of the month, and they come along the stream channel because it is the easiest ground in the valley. I never got a clean look at one. What I got was the noise, which went on for about 2 hours. Then a series of giants being carried into the space outside my shed on their own doors. 11 wounded, in 2 hours. In a settlement of about 200, in a village that wins every single one of these fights, and had won this one too, and had killed 4 of the things down by the channel. I worked from before midnight to about noon the next day. I cannot give most of that night back as pictures. What I remember is the order, because the order was the only thing I actually controlled that night. Chest wound that is sucking, any bleeder that pushes instead of runs, airway, then the deep dirty ones, then the fractures, then everything that can wait until the light, and you say it out loud so people can hear you. Garda ran the outside. That started that night and it never stopped. She had 1 arm and a 14-day-old scar, and she stood in the dark and told 8 giants where to put people and in what order. She invented the thing that won a war 9 years later on the 139th day after I woke up in that field, and what she actually did was put the worst ones nearest the fire and the boiling pot. By dawn, I had done 9 of the 11. 1 of them died in front of me in the night, and 1 died on the 6th day. A 12th man never came in at all, and he died on the 8th, and those 3 are the slate. Vern was the 12th. Older than Dorn, and he had a leg opened by a claw that night. He packed it with pitch himself and told nobody, because he had done it that way for 160 years. They brought him to me on the 8th day. The leg was black to the middle of the calf. The smell was in the room before he was. The skin above it crackled under my fingers when I pressed it. That is gas in the tissue. There is no washing that. There is no drain that reaches it. In my own world, with everything in my own world, that leg comes off, and it comes off in the next hour. So I took a giant's leg off below the knee with Tavis Cray's saw. I want that written down exactly, because the story people tell about me is that I came here to stop the cutting, and that is not true. I have taken limbs. I took 14 in the first 2 years. Amputation is a real operation with a real indication. The whole crime in Ordain was never the saw. It was doing it on day 4 instead of day 40. Vern died on the table anyway, halfway through, and I think it was his heart. I think the pain did it, and I could not have told you that at the time with any confidence at all. Scylla was 30-odd, and she had a puncture between 2 ribs on the right. The wound on the outside of her was the length of my thumb, and there was nothing to wash out and nothing to drain. Whatever went in there went in deep. By the 4th day, she had a fever I could not touch, and her breathing was fast and shallow, and her skin was mottled, and by the 6th, she was gone. I could not have saved her at home either, not without a chest drain and a surgical team and a hospital pharmacy behind me. I have no medicines at all, and that comes up again. I have boiling water, soap, a blade, a drain, and thread. That is a complete answer to a huge fraction of what kills people in Ordain, and it is no answer at all to an infection that is already in the blood. Bo was 8, giant 8, which is about my height. He had come out of a doorway during the fight because he heard his mother shouting, and something opened the inside of his thigh. They brought him in second, which was right, and I had my hand in the wound within a minute of him arriving. I could not find the end of the vessel because it had retracted up under the muscle. I opened him further. I got 2 fingers up alongside the bone. I had on pressing at the groin with the whole weight of his arm, and I still had blood coming past both of us, and there was so much of it. He died on the floor of my shed with 4 adults, holding him and me, elbow deep in his leg. The thing that would have saved him is a transfusion, and I cannot make blood out of boiled water. I have thought about that boy more than about anybody else in the first year. There was a version of that night where I got the vessel in the first 90 seconds. I cannot convince myself that I would have. So on the 141st day, I sat down and made the ledger. I want to explain why, because everybody assumes it was grief, and it was only about a third grief. 12 years earlier, in my other life, a hospital I worked in reported its numbers wrong for 2 years, not by lying, but by rounding. Deaths under a certain heading got moved into a different heading. Nobody in that building was a villain. It happened because nobody had to write a name down by hand. I have watched a rounded number kill people, and it kills them slowly, and it never leaves a fingerprint. So I took a roof slate and a charcoal stick, and I wrote Vern, Scylla, Bo, the day, and what killed each of them, and what I would have needed and did not have. Then I read the three of them out loud in the doorway of the shed, not for the village. There was nobody there. I read them out loud because a number you have said with your mouth is harder to move later. That slate became a law. Every clean house in the empire keeps one, and it is not optional, and it is not for the accounts. It exists so that nobody, including me, can ever quietly turn 3 into about 2. Tally at the end of the 150th day, 42 patients, 61 wounds, 4 limbs I could not save and took myself, no students, no houses, 3 names on a roof slate. And on the 151st morning, the queue outside my door was different. There were 7 giants in it, and not one of them was injured. And Garda was standing at the front of them with her arm folded. She said they had not come to be treated. She said they had come because she had been telling them what I did to her arm, and she had got it wrong 4 times running, and they wanted it from me. They did not want to be treated, and they did not want to be told it was a gift. They wanted to know how it is done, so that when the beasts came down again, they would not have to wait in a line outside my door. I taught the truth first. It took me 12 days to find out that the truth does not work. The way I found out was watching a giant nod along to every word I said and then put a thread in his mouth to wet it. That was On. On is not stupid. On had held a hand press on a boy's groin for 40 minutes and had run my boiling pot for 2 months without once letting the water go off the boil. I had explained it to him properly. Things too small to see. They live in dirt and in spit and in old cloth. They get into the meat and they double. And the yellow is them, and the boiling kills them. He agreed with all of it. He asked good questions. He asked whether they were in the water too, which is an excellent question, and whether they were in the air, which is a better one. And then on the 10th morning, I watched him thread a curved needle by drawing the silk between his lips, because that is how every person in that village has threaded every needle their whole life. I did not shout at him. I sat down outside the shed with my back against the stone, and I had a bad hour, because the failure was mine, and it was the same failure I had had in the chapel at Low Hollow. An explanation is a thing a person agrees with. Agreement lives in the front of your head, and it does not reach your hands. Your hands do what they have always done, especially when there is blood on the floor. Halda did it too, differently. She would boil a blade for a count of 300 perfectly, then take it out of the pot with a hand she had used to push a door open and hand it to me by the blade. Neither of them was ignoring me. Both of them believed me. They believed me, and their hands carried on obeying 400 years of habit, because I had given them a theory, and habits do not lose to theories. So I stopped explaining and I wrote a right instead, and I did it on purpose, knowing exactly what I was doing. I have never once pretended since that it was an accident of translation. That was the decision, and it is the least heroic thing I ever did, and it is probably the thing that saved the most people. I sat down with a slate and I wrote 5 lines, short enough to say in one breath, hard enough to be worth saying, nothing in them about anything invisible, because you cannot check the invisible and you can check a line. 1. The water boils while you count to 300. 2. Hands to the elbow, before and after everyone. 3. Fresh thread, and a used thread is not thread. 4. Pus must be given a way out. 5. Do not open a wound you have nothing to close it with. That is the whole charter, and there is not one word in it about anything you cannot check on the spot. 5 lines. I made On and Halda say them back to me. Then I made them say them together. And by the 3rd day, the 2 of them said them at the start of every single job, out loud, before touching anything. By the 2nd week, they said them in unison. By the 4th week, the giants who were only carrying stretchers said them. By the end of the year, children in Stone Step were skipping to them, and I did not stop that either. Dorn Stone Shoulder came and sat in my doorway on about the 40th day of it, and told me exactly what I had done. He was not being kind, and I did not defend myself, because he was right. He said, "You have made a prayer," and he put his hand flat on the slate with the 5 lines cut into it while he said it. He did not take his hand off it until I answered him. He said, "They say your 5 lines the way the priest at Ashwater says his over a wound, in the same voice, in the same place in the job." He said, "You told me there was nothing holy in what you do." I told him the truth. I said, "There is nothing holy in it. It is a list of things to check, of the sort a careful man writes down so that a tired man cannot forget them. Say it in whatever voice you like." He asked me whether it bothered me. It did. It still does. I have spent 12 years watching my own instructions get chanted. Every year somebody asks me to bless something, and every year I say no. But here is the arithmetic, and the arithmetic decided it. An explanation was obeyed by nobody. A rite was obeyed by everybody, including at 4 in the morning, including with blood on the floor. I would rather be a ritual that works than a lecture that is agreed with. That is not a noble position. It is just the only one that gets the thread out of a man's mouth, and it got the thread out of On's mouth. Rule 5 is the one nobody understood, and Rule 5 is the one that has saved the most people. I only knew to write it because of what happened at Highfall in the middle of that same month. Highfall is a giant settlement 2 valleys east. A trader carried the news to them, and the news was the version Garda had been telling, which was that a small man had cut her arm open and it got better. A hunter there had a claw wound in the back of his shoulder, 4 days old, pitched over. Someone in Highfall decided he understood the new method well enough, and he opened that shoulder up with a skinning knife. He had no boiled water, he had no soap on his hands, he had no thread of any kind, and no drain, and no idea that the low end of a wound is where the road out goes, and he had never seen it done. So he laid a 4-day-old infected shoulder wide open in a cold room, and then had nothing to do about it. The thing he had done was worse than doing nothing, and the man lost the arm at the shoulder. He lived. That is the only reason there are still 3 names on my slate and not 4. Highfall took the arm off with an axe 16 days later, and the man is alive, and he cannot draw a bow. I heard about it from the trader on the way back through. I did not go and shout at anybody in Highfall. I wrote Rule 5 that night, in the exact words it still has, and I made On and Halda learn it first. Do not open a wound you have nothing to close it with. The opening is not the sin. An open wound with no water, no thread, and no drain behind it is a door you have unlocked for the thing you are most afraid of. That is the honest cost of giving a method away for nothing. People will half hear it, and the half they hear will be the cutting, because the cutting is the part that looks like the work. Every technology I brought into Ordain got somebody hurt on the way in. Every one. That is not a reason to hold it back, and it is a reason to write the rules in a form that survives being repeated by a stranger. On and Halda were my first 2 students, formally, on the 171st day. I gave them the same examination I have given 900 people since, and I made it up on the spot. 3 wounds each, done in front of me, from the boiling to the last knot, with me forbidden to touch anything, 1 clean cut to close, 1 dirty wound to lay open and drain, 1 abscess to find and open. On failed the abscess the first time. He found it, opened it across the crease instead of along it. I stopped him and made him do the next 1 4 days later, and he got it right, and he has got it right ever since. Halda passed all 3 at the first attempt, and then asked me what she was allowed to refuse. I had no answer ready for her. She said, "If a hunter tells me to sew a 7-day-old pitched wound shut, what do I say?" I told her she says no, and that she says it with Rule 5, that if the hunter is bigger than her, she says it anyway, that if she is ever overruled, she is to write down who overruled her. That is the second half of the standard, and I did not know it yet. But a written objection from a student who was ignored has saved more lives in my houses than any operation I ever performed. 2 students. That is what the count says at the end of that stretch, and it is a ridiculous number. Both of them could open an abscess and close a clean wound better than any bone setter in Marnhold. The other thing that happened in those 2 months was that Stone Step stopped burning the cliff band and started guarding it. The person who worked out how was not me. It was a hunter called Brack. The weavers take goats. That is a real complaint, and I never pretended otherwise. Brack's answer was that a spur beast is about 700 kilos of meat that nobody in the village can use, and we kill 4 a month. So the offal went up the cliff band instead of into the stream, twice a month in baskets, left at the mouths of the caves by 2 people with no fire. The weavers stopped coming down for goats within about 5 weeks. 7 nests along that band by the autumn, 3 of them reoccupied once nobody came up with a torch. 4 under guard and on a rota with a yield of about 5 arms lengths of line a visit and a rule against cutting the core. By the end of that year, Stone Step had gone from burning its own future twice a year to feeding it. It happened because a 1-armed elder let a hunter argue with him for 1 evening about offal. Tally at the 210th day, 70 patients, 2 students, no houses, 3 names, unchanged, and I was starting to believe that the slate would stay short if I just worked harder. The news from over the pass arrived with the same trader. He said a guild bone setter had been asking in 3 valleys about a man with no charter and a stolen saw, and paying for the asking. He said the man asking had crystal lenses on a cord and had bought a full round of drinks for the mill village at Low Hollow, and had asked whether the boy with the thigh was still walking, and had been told yes. Then, on the 211th day, 4 giants carried Brog into the yard on a door, and Brog was not bleeding, and Brog had not been bleeding for 9 years. His right thigh had been broken by a falling stone when he was 18. It had been left to heal by itself, because that is what you do here. It had healed at an angle you could see from 100 paces. He walked on it. He had walked on it for 9 years, and his knee and his back and his other hip had all been paying for it. The pain was now bad enough that he had asked his brothers to carry him to me. I knew exactly what the operation was. You break it again at the old site, you pull it straight, and you hold it straight while it heals. That is the whole operation, and I have done it many times. And I stood in the yard with my hands on a giant's thigh and understood that I could not do a single part of it, because to break a giant's femur and pull it into line, you have to hold the giant still. 4 of them could not hold Garda's forearm properly while I cleaned it. This is a thigh bone, the thickness of my chest, on a man who can lift a door with 2 people standing on it, and the pull needed is enormous. And even if I had a dozen giants and a winch, and I did eventually have both, the pain of breaking that bone in a man who is awake will stop his heart before I get anywhere near putting it straight. I killed Brog on the 259th day I spent in Ordain, with my own hand, with a measured cup. He never woke up, and the operation I had spent 7 weeks preparing never even started. Take the 7 weeks first, because the 7 weeks were right. I would do most of them again, and the mistake at the end of them was not stupidity. It was arrogance about a number. It began with Dornstone Shoulder's tally board, and with a question I asked him in the Longhouse because I needed data, and he was the only person in Ordain who had any. 34 limbs, taken off with the axe by his own hand over 14 years. 17 of those people had died. I asked him to tell me how many of the 17 had died within the hour, on the block. He knew. That is what an old man with a knife and a piece of wood is for. He had cut the deep notch for a death on the block, and a shallow one for a death afterwards, because those 2 things feel different to the man holding the axe. 11 of the 17 died within the hour. 6 died over the following weeks of the rot he had failed to get ahead of. 11 out of 34 dead on the block, and not one of them from the axe going wrong. That is the number that nobody in this world had ever written down. 2/3 of the deaths from an amputation in Stone Step happen while the patient is being held down, and they are not deaths from bleeding. I have watched it happen. It happened to Vern on my own floor. A person who is being cut into while awake goes gray and clammy, and their pulse climbs and thins, and then at some point the pulse stops. The pain does that, not the wound, not the blood loss, not an infection that has not had time to start. Fear and pain together drive a body until it quits, and in a person who is already old or already bleeding, it quits. Nobody in Ordain considered this a problem, and the reason for that is not savagery. The reason is that pain is not treated as a thing with consequences. It is treated as the price. You pay for the leg with screaming. Those are the terms. If you die during the paying, then the rot had already gone too high. The priest says the will of the light, and Dorn cuts a deep notch. For a giant, it is not a problem. It is a wall. 4 adults could barely hold Garda's forearm still while I washed it. Brog's thigh bone is thicker than my chest, and he can lift a door with 2 people on it. To break a healed femur at the old site and pull it straight, you need a sustained pull that I eventually made with a winch and 4 giants on a rope. You cannot do that to a man who is fighting you. And you cannot do it to a man who is awake even if he agrees not to fight, because the pain of that will stop his heart before I get the bone anywhere near straight. That operation is simply impossible while he can feel it. So for 7 weeks, I went looking for sleep. And I tried 3 things before the goblins. I am putting the failures in, because the failures are how you know the 4th thing was not luck. Drink first. The miller at Low Hollow had grain spirit, and I had used it on a pin, and the traders carry it. Every human story about surgery in my own world's history has a man biting a bottle. It does not work. It never worked at home either. A man drunk enough not to feel a knife is a man whose breathing is already unreliable and who bleeds more freely, and you cannot get him drunk enough anyway. I tried it on a volunteer for an abscess in the armpit, with about half of what a giant that size drinks socially. He felt every bit of it, and he was also sick down my arm. That was the end of that. Cold second. Cold genuinely does something. A limb held in the stream above the settlement for a long count goes numb enough that a shallow cut is bearable. I used that for years afterwards on fingers and toes. But you cannot chill a thigh, and you cannot chill a giant. You cannot keep a limb cold for the 2 hours a deep job takes without doing damage to the limb you're trying to save. Poppy third, which is the guild's own product, and getting it was the first trade I ever made in Ordain, and I paid for it in silk. 2 arms lengths of mountain weaver line for a stone jar of draft. Poppy dulls pain. It does not abolish it. It made a fracture reduction on a hunter's wrist possible instead of appalling. I have used it every year since, and I would not work without it. But there is a straight line on it. The amount that dulls the pain leaves the patient awake and reacting. The amount that stops them reacting stops their breathing at almost the same point. And I found that out on a goat. I want that in the record. I tested Poppy to failure on animals before I tested it on people. I learned that the gap between deep sleep and dead is narrow, and then I ignored what I had learned. Hold that thought. The goblins came into it in the 8th week, and they came in as peddlers, which is the only way any goblin was allowed anywhere near Stone Step at that point in history. There were marsh goblins living 2 days east of the pass, in the wet ground where nobody else wanted to be. They were the reason Stone Step had salt and dye and dried herbs, and everyone despised them for it. They came 4 at a time with baskets. They traded at a stone at the edge of the settlement. They were never let inside the houses. The giants counted their livestock afterwards, and I saw all of that and said nothing. I have since been asked why I did not object to it in that first year. I did not object because I needed a plant, and because I was one exiled human in a village that had not yet decided whether to keep me. The oldest of the 4 was a man called Tup, and he was about my height. He had about 40 years of weather in his face and hands that were quicker than mine. He asked me why my knuckles were split. I told him, boiling water 40 times a day. And Tup went into a basket and gave me a gray ointment for it that worked better than anything I had, then asked me what I wanted because peddlers know that face. I asked him what he had for pain. He laid out 5 things on the trading stone. Willow bark, which I knew. 2 things I could not place. Poppy, worse than the guilds. And a bundle of dried gray-green root he called hoodwort. He told me what it was for. A smear of the wash on a bad tooth. A little of it in water for a child who will not stop screaming with the earache. And he told me the rest without me asking, because he was a good peddler and honest. He said, "Past that they sleep and you cannot wake them, and past that again they sleep and do not come back." My grandmother's brother went that way, and that is why we marked the jars. Nobody in Ordain had ever tried to put a person all the way under on purpose. Why would they? In every part of this world, a person who cannot be woken is a person who is dying, and the only question is how long it takes. There is no idea here of a sleep you come back out of, so a plant that reliably produces, one has been sitting in a marsh basket for centuries, priced as a toothache remedy next to the dye. I tested it on myself, not out of courage, out of not having anybody else I was willing to test it on, and because I know my own body better than I know a giant's. The smallest measure I could make, sitting on the floor with Halda watching me. Dry mouth in about 10 minutes. Then my eyes would not focus at the right distance, and everything close to me had 2 edges. Then an hour of feeling as if I had been awake for 3 days. No sleep at all. Twice that the next week. I lost about half an hour. I do not remember them. Halda told me afterwards that I had answered her questions, and that my answers had been reasonable, and that my pulse had stayed strong. Then, on the 241st day, I used it on a person for a job for the first time. It was the best hour of my first year, and it made every single thing that came after it possible. A hunter called Rel, with an abscess deep in the armpit that had to be opened and packed, which is one of the most brutal small operations there is. 3 measures of the wash in water, counted off his weight, and he was giant-sized. He went sleepy in about a quarter of an hour, not out, sleepy and slow and uninterested. I opened the abscess, washed it, packed it, and had the whole thing finished inside 20 minutes, and he made 2 noises. Afterwards, he asked me when I was going to start. He did not remember it. Halda sat down on the floor and put her hands over her face, and An asked me, very quietly, whether the bone work was possible now, and that is where I lost my footing, and I lost it in the good way, which is how you lose it when something has just worked. I had one success on a giant of a certain size, and I decided I understood the plant. Brog was bigger than Rel. Not much. Enough. He was also older by about 13 years. He had been in pain for 9 of them. He was thinner than he looked because of what the pain had done to his eating. I did the arithmetic in my head. More body, more of the wash. Rel had 3 measures. Brog was heavier, so 5. I said the number out loud to On, and On wrote it on the slate, and the slate still exists, and it still says 5. One thing I did not do. I did not test that particular jar against the jar I had used on Rel. It was a new jar out of a new basket from a different gatherer, bought 16 days later at the trading stone. Tup had told me they marked the jars. He had told me the strength differs. He had told me his grandmother's brother died of the difference. I had it directly from the only expert on the continent, and I did not weigh it. Brog drank it at the 9th hour of the morning, in the yard, with the winch built and the ropes laid out, and 4 of his own brothers standing by to pull, and Garda outside keeping the crowd back. He went sleepy in about 10 minutes, faster than Rel. I noticed that it was faster. I noted it out loud, and I remember exactly what I said, which was that this batch seemed stronger, and we should go carefully. Then he stopped talking. Then his breathing slowed. Then it went shallow, and then there were long gaps in it. I got my ear to his chest, and his heart was going slow and hard, and then slow and soft. I did everything I have. I put him on his side. I cleared his mouth. I got On to hold his jaw forward. I put both hands on the lower half of that chest and pushed with my whole weight and moved nothing at all. I tried to breathe for him. Picture that honestly. I am 1.80 meters and he is 3.5 meters, and I got my mouth over his and blew, and his chest did not move, and I did it 50 times. His heart stopped a little before noon. The knife had never come out of the pot. His thigh was still bent the way it had been bent for 9 years, and it was going to stay that way, and he had come to me on a door. His brothers carried him back out on the same door. Nobody hit me. Nobody said a word to me. That is worse, and everybody who has ever been in that position knows it is worse. I wrote Brog on the slate under Vern, Scylla, and Bo, and I wrote the day and where the jar came from, the number 5, and my own name next to it, because the cause of death was me. Then I read the 4 names out loud in the doorway, which I had promised myself I would keep doing. I got to the 4th one, and I could not say the rest of the sentence, and I said it eventually. Dorn Stoneshoulder came in that evening, and he did not bring the axe or the board, and he did not comfort me. He asked me one question, and he waited a long time for the answer, and the answer changed everything. He asked whether the sleep was still worth having. He asked it as a man who had held people down for 14 years and who wanted a straight answer from the only person in the valley who could give him one. I had to sit with that. 11 dead on his block in 14 years, from the pain out of 34, 1 dead in my yard from the sleep out of 2, and no possible operation on a giant's bone without it, ever. So, I said yes. And then I said the thing that was actually true, which is that the plant was not the problem. The problem was that I had guessed a number out of my head on a jar I had not tested, with nobody counting. The thing that made the second half of my life possible was not a plant, and it was not a needle. It was a man sitting on a stone with nothing to do except say a number out loud, over and over, for 3 hours. I did not invent sleep. Tup's people had hoodwort in a basket before I was born. What I invented, and I will take credit for this one, is the set of controls that stop the sleep from killing the patient. There are 3 of them, and I wrote them in the 19 days after Brog died. They have not changed in 12 years, and every clean house we have runs on them. The first one. Every batch is weighed against the last batch before it is ever used on a person. The jar is marked, and an unmarked jar is not medicine. It is a jar. I got that from Tup, honestly. He told me his people mark their jars, and I did not ask him how. When I finally asked, on the 264th day, he took me out to the marsh camp to show me. They test on a marsh dog, one animal of a known size, kept for the purpose, dosed with a drop of the new wash. They watch how long it takes to go down and whether it comes back up. That is a whole method. It has been sitting in a marsh 2 days east of the pass for generations, and no priest, no guild master, and no lord had ever walked out there to ask a goblin how they mark a jar. I made it better in exactly one way. I did it with goats of known weight, and I recorded 2 numbers instead of 1. The second number is the one that matters, and is the one nobody had ever written down. Number 1 is the drops per weight, at which the animal goes down. Number 2 is the drops per weight at which the animal stops breathing. The distance between the two numbers is where all the safety in the operation lives. Some batches have a wide gap. Some batches are close, and a close batch is a jar you use for toothache and never for a bone job. You mark it, and you do not throw it away because pretending it does not exist is worse. Brog's jar, tested afterwards on 2 goats, was the strongest jar I ever handled. On the same drops per weight as Rel's, it put both goats out and killed one. I tested it after he was in the ground. I should have tested it before. The second rule: the dose is counted from the weight of the body and never from the look of the patient. That meant I had to find out how much a giant weighs, and nobody in Ordain had any idea. You cannot put a giant on a scale. There is no scale. What Stone Step has is a stone channel carrying the stream through the settlement with a plugged trough in it for washing hides, and that turned out to be enough. I filled the trough to a scratched line, had a giant get in and lie down under the water with his head out, and had 4 people bail out the water that came over the top of the line into counted buckets. Then we let the trough refill to the line, and I knew how many buckets of water that giant displaced, and a bucket of water weighs what a bucket of water weighs, and Halda and I worked out the rest with a beam and stones. The whole village came to watch that. Somebody got in for a bet. Somebody else got in with a goat under one arm to see whether the goat counted. On wrote every result on a slate with the person's name against it. By the end of a week, we had the weight of about 50 adult giants in buckets. I had a table, and a table is the only reason anybody has ever safely put a 3.5-meter patient to sleep. Every clean house in the Empire now has a weighing trough. It is the second thing you build after the boiling shed. 900 graduates think it is completely ordinary, and it started as a hidewash and a bet. The third rule is the one that matters most, and it is the one that costs nothing at all. At every operation with sleep, one person sits at the patient's head. Their entire job is to count the breathing out loud. Not help, not hold, not hand over instruments. They count the breaths out loud, in tens, forever, and they do not stop. They do not look at the wound, and they never touch a tool. And if the count changes, they say so, and the cutting stops. Not slows, stops, hands out of the wound, and everybody waits, however long it takes. The counter is the one who says when it starts again. I have been asked 100 times whether a person can really be spared for that. In a village of 200 that has 11 wounded in a night, giving one adult to counting looks like waste, and it looked like waste to Dorn too. Here is the argument I gave him, and it is the only argument I have ever needed. The counter is not doing nothing. The counter is the only person in the room who is watching the thing that kills the patient. I am watching the wound. I am elbow deep in a thigh with 4 people pulling on a rope, and my whole attention is on a bone. I did not notice Brog's breathing change, and I was a pace and a half from his face. An became the first counter in Ordain. He is the man who ran my boiling pot for 2 months, and who once threaded a needle with his mouth. He turned out to have exactly the temperament for it. The second profession of my school was born out of Brog dying. There are 211 counters working in the Empire now. They are paid the same as the ones holding the knife, and that was deliberate. Then we did the operation. 50 days after the one that killed Brog, the patient volunteered, and I tried to talk him out of it twice. Kel was Brog's brother. They had both been under the same rockfall when Kel was 15 and Brog was 18. Brog's thigh healed crooked. Kel's lower leg healed crooked, less badly, and he had walked on it for 9 years. He came to me on the 299th day and said he wanted it straightened. I said his brother had died in this yard from the sleep, and he said yes, he had carried him out of it on the door. He said, if it works on me, my brother's death bought something. If it kills me, my mother has already buried one son this year, and she has agreed to it. Go and speak to her. And I went and spoke to her, and she had. That operation took 3 hours and 11 minutes, and there were 8 people in the shed, and it is the most complicated thing I did in my first year, so I will walk it through. We weighed him in the trough the day before, 11 buckets over the line, which put him just under Rel and well under Brog. Jar tested on 2 goats 4 days earlier, marked wide, 1/3 of a jar left in it. I gave it in steps, not all at once, which is what I did to Brog, 1/3 of the calculated dose, then wait and watch, then another 1/3 if he was still answering questions, then the last 1/3 only if needed. He never needed the last 1/3. That is all the difference between the 2 operations. steps and a stop rule instead of a number out of my head. On sat at his head with a hand flat on his chest and counted the breaths in tens out loud from before I touched him to after he woke up. He did not stop once in 3 hours and 11 minutes. The winch was Brack's build, a frame of dry stone and beam over the door, a rope through a block, and a cradle for the foot, with 4 giants on the tail of the rope and a mark on the beam to pull to. I opened the old break site with a blade, which is a long incision on a giant, and got down to the bone. The bone had a mass of overgrowth on it like a knot in a tree, and I had to take that off before anything else. Then Brack's rope took the strain, and the 4 of them pulled to the mark. The old break gave with a sound I felt through the floor, and the lower leg came into line with the upper. And then, at about the 2-hour mark, with the bone held straight and the ends bedded, and my hands inside his leg, On stopped counting in tens and said, "It has gone slow," and I stopped. Hands out, blade down on the boiled cloth. 4 giants told to hold the rope still and not pull and not let go, and me kneeling there with a leg open and doing absolutely nothing for 7 minutes. Everybody in that shed watched a 1.80 m human take an order from a giant with a slate in the middle of an operation and obey it without arguing. That was the most important thing that happened all day. Kel's breathing came back up on its own. On said, "It is even again," and I asked him twice, and he said it twice, and I put my hands back in and finished the job. I built the hold out of what a mountain village has, a wooden trough splint around the whole thing, packed with wet hide that dries tight, then a rope from his ankle over the beam with stones on the end of it. 22 stones the size of my head, in a basket, hanging off his ankle, day and night for 13 weeks. One person's job on the rota was to check the basket and the skin under the splint every morning. He woke up 2 hours after I finished. He asked for water and then asked whether the pull had happened yet, and On told him it had happened and had finished. He did not believe it until he was shown his own leg. 13 weeks later, Kel walked out of that shed on 2 legs that were the same length, with a limp he still has. He walked up the cliff band to cut silk that autumn with the rota. I did 7 more bone jobs in the next fortnight, all of them fresh fractures rather than 9-year-old ones, all of them under sleep, all of them with a counter at the head, and none of them died. Tally at the 330th day, which is as close as I ever came to keeping a birthday in Ordain. 130 patients, 4 students, no houses, 4 names in the ledger. The 4 students were On, Halda, Brack, and a young hunter called Aura, who had lost her mother on Dorn's block 4 years before, and who asked to be taught in the same sentence in which she told me that. And on the 331st morning, Garda came into the shed and told me to come to the top of the track, because there were 7 goblins standing at the boundary stone in the rain. Not 4, not at the trading stone. 7, at the boundary, which nobody had ever done. They had a white rag tied to the end of a stick, and they were holding it up where the whole village could see it. 7 goblins stood at the boundary stone of Stone Step in the rain with a white rag on a stick. I nearly lost everything I had built in this world over the next 4 days, and not to an enemy. Old Tup was one of the 7. He was soaked through, and he had walked 2 days, and he was holding the stick up over his head with both hands because his arms had started shaking about an hour before. Something had come down the east side of the spurs into the wet ground 4 nights earlier. Not into Stone Step, because Stone Step has 200 giants and a stone channel and a hunting party. Into the marsh camp, which has about 160 goblins, reed houses, no wall, and nothing that can stop anything. They lost 9 dead on the night, and they had 30 wounded when Tup started walking. 30 wounded, and not one person in that camp who knew how to wash a wound out. Not one. They had my gray ointment, which is theirs, and they had willow bark, and they had a marsh full of standing water. Tup did not ask me to come. He asked me for the words. He said he had heard from the hide traders that the small human at Stone Step had 5 lines that people said over a wound, and would I give him the 5 lines? He had walked 2 days in the rain to memorize a chant, because he could not read, and because he assumed a human with a working method would not walk out to a goblin camp for any price he could pay. Stone Step said, "No, I need to give you the full weight of that, because it was not a handful of bigots, it was most of a village. Their reasons were specific and true and written on a slate. 16 goats in the previous year, 14 the year before, a dye theft, a boy called Ist who went into the marsh after 2 goats in the winter of the year before and came out of it dead, drowned in the Goblin Channel. Nobody in that village believed the goblins killed Ist. What they believed was that Ist would be alive if goblins did not steal goats. There is no arguing with that because it is probably true. So, when I said I was going and that I was taking Silk Blades, Poppy, and 2 students, about half the longhouse stood up, not to hit me, to tell me that the boiling pot and the shed were the village's and not mine. That was a fair point, and it was a real threat. It was made by a woman whose brother had been carried in on a door with a shoulder wound in the autumn, and who had every right to say it. I made 3 arguments, and only the 3rd one worked. The 2 that failed are worth naming, because I hear people quote the wrong one back at me now as though it was the noble bit. The first argument was that a wounded person is a wounded person. Complete failure. Nobody in that room disputed it, and nobody in that room moved. In Ordain, that sentence has never once decided anything. The second argument was the pass. If 160 goblins die in the marsh, whatever came down the east side of the spurs has nothing left to eat out there and comes over the ridge to the next settlement. That one moved about 8 people. It is a good argument, and it is also a threat dressed as a kindness, and Dornstone Shoulder saw through it immediately and told me not to insult him. The third argument was Dorn's own board, and I did not make it, he did. He made it standing up in the middle of the long house with the board in his good hand. He said, I have cut 105 notches into this in 14 years, and it has never once told me whose they were. He said, a notch is a notch. It does not know the difference between a giant and a goat thief. Then he said, the sentence that became a law of my empire, and that has been carved over the door of every clean house since. He said it as an old man's practical opinion and not as a principle. He said, the only question that has ever made this board shorter is who is closest to dying. The only rule I will put my hand to is that we go in that order. That is triage. He invented the political version of it in a long house in the rain, and I only supplied the medical version. I never once let anybody credit me with it in his hearing. Then he sent 14 giants with me to carry, which I had not asked for. He told the woman who had objected that the pot was the village's and that the village was sending it, and she came with us. The marsh camp broke me in a way Stone Step never had, because Stone Step at least had a fight to blame. The goblins had nothing. 9 dead in one night, 30 wounded, and no idea at all that a wound could be treated. They had bound the wounds with reed cloth, over the dirt, tight, for 4 days in wet heat. When we cut the first binding off a boy's forearm, the smell came up out of it, and one of the giants had to walk away. And this is the fact that decided my next 10 years. I noticed it inside the first hour, and I could not stop noticing it. All 30 of those wounds were small. Everyone. Small, shallow, and completely survivable. They are my size and smaller. Nothing had bitten a limb off. They were claw cuts and puncture wounds, and 1 broken forearm. If a single person in that camp had known how to wash and drain them, they would have lost nobody. 4 of them died. 2 before we arrived, of blood loss, and 2 under my hands. Their names are Nib, who was 12, and Kesh, who was old and had a chest wound like Scylla's and went the same way. Nib died because I got to him on the 5th day, and the infection was already in his blood. There is nothing on this world that I can do about that, and I have written the same sentence 4 times now. 26 lived, 26 out of 30, in a camp where the expected outcome was that anybody with an open wound dies, because that is the only outcome any of them had ever seen. The work itself was the hardest of my first year, for reasons that have nothing to do with medicine. There is no dry ground, there is no clean water, there is no wood because it is a marsh, and everything burns badly. Peat. That was the answer, and Tup's people already had it. Peat burns hot and slow, and it will hold a pot at the boil for hours. They had been cooking on it for generations, and nobody had ever boiled water for a wound on it. Rain for the water, off the reed roofs into a stone jar, then boiled to a count of 300, then cooled. Standing marsh water for nothing at all, not even for washing hands, because I have seen what is in it. And the fine work. That is where I hit the wall that changed the whole school. My silk was mountain weaver line, cut for a giant's forearm, and it is about the thickness of a bootlace. I sewed a goblin child's forearm with thread meant for a 3.5-meter hunter. It was like closing a shirt with rope, and the knots were bigger than the wound edges they were holding. Worse than that, my hands were wrong. My fingers are a normal human's, and a goblin's forearm is about the size of my wrist. There were 2 wounds in that camp I could not close well and had to leave open to heal badly. Tup's granddaughter did them, and it is not a comfortable thing to put on the record. It is what happened on the 6th day, because I could not fit into the work and she could, and she had watched me for 5 days. Her name was Pika, and she was 19, and she had hands about half the size of mine, and she was the calmest person in that camp, including me, and everything in the rest of this comes back to her. Now the part I have never enjoyed telling. On the 4th day, back at Stone Step, with 14 of the worst goblins carried over the ridge on doors to be near the boiling shed, the order of the queue was tested. A hunter called Vess came in with a cut on the back of his calf, 2 days old, clean, about the length of my thumb, nothing in it, no redness, 10 minutes of work and completely genuine, and he wanted it done. In front of him, on the ground, were 4 goblins on hides, one of them with a claw wound in the belly wall that I was frightened of. I told Vess he was 5th, and that 5th meant about 3 hours. He picked me up, one hand, front of my shirt, feet off the floor. He held me at the height of his own face and asked me whether I had understood who had carried the pot over the ridge. I did not have a clever answer, and my voice did the thing it does, and what saved that afternoon was not me. Halda stepped in front of him and said the order out loud, in the words I had taught her, and she did not raise her voice. She said, "Worst first." She said, "That is the rule, and you sign nothing but you eat out of the same kill as the man on the hide. If you want to be first, go and get a worse wound." He put me down. He waited 3 hours. He got his 10 minutes, and it healed clean. And 10 years later, that man commanded a stretcher line in a war and put an enemy soldier ahead of his own cousin. And I saw him do it. Brack refused. That is the other half of the story, and it is the reason the school has a suspension rule. Brack was one of my 4 students, the man who built the winch, the man who thought of the awful. He would not lay hands on a goblin. He said it plainly, and he did not shout, and he did not hide behind anything. He said his uncle had lost 40 goats over 20 years, and he was not going to wash a thief's arm. I took him off the rota, in front of the others. Not out of anger, I told him the reason, and I made it the same reason as everything else, which is that a person who chooses the order by rank makes the tally board longer. He was off the rota for 9 days. On the 10th he came back and he did not apologize, and he did not explain, and he started boiling water, and Halda handed him a blade, and nobody said anything about it ever again. 9 days is what it cost. I have run that suspension rule for 12 years, and the average is about 5 days. I have only ever had to make it permanent once, 7 years later, over a journal entry. Tup got his 5 lines. He got them on the first evening, from me, sitting on a reed mat with the rain coming through the roof. He said them back to me 30 times until he had them exactly. Then he taught them to his camp, out loud in a circle, as you would teach a song. By the time I left the marsh, there were 160 goblins who could recite the 5 rules of clean hands. Not one of them could read. It did not matter in the slightest. I have never been more certain that I made the right call in the chapel of my own failures than I was standing in that marsh listening to it. Tally at the 380th day, 200 patients. 6 students, because Tup's granddaughter and another goblin had already started following me with a pot. No houses, 6 names written down by hand. I was packing to go back over the ridge when Pika came and got me and took me to a reed house at the edge of the camp. She did not tell me what was in it, and I should have guessed from her face. There was a goblin woman on a mat in there called Ressa, at full term. I did not know what full term meant for a goblin, so I asked, and Pika held up one hand with the finger spread and then one finger more. 6. They carry 6. And then I asked the second question, the one I ask everywhere, which is how many mothers this camp loses. And Pika answered it without having to think about it at all. 1 in 3. She said it the way you say the price of salt. And then she said that about half of what is born does not last the first week either. She was 19 and she had already helped at 17 of them. The biggest killer I met in my first 2 years in Ordain was not a spur beast, a rotting wound, or a bone setter's saw. It was a reed house with 1 woman in it and a rule that nobody else was allowed inside. Goblin women give birth alone. That is the custom, and it is old and it is absolute. A woman goes into a reed house at the edge of the camp when it starts, and she comes out with what she comes out with. Being seen doing it is shameful, and it is said to be unlucky for the children, and so for as long as anybody in that marsh could remember, nobody had ever attended a birth, and therefore nobody had ever learned anything about one. That is not backwardness. It is the exact mechanism. You cannot accumulate a craft that nobody is permitted to watch. 160 goblins had 100 generations of births behind them, and no midwives at all. They carry 6, sometimes 5, occasionally 7. 1 in 3 mothers dies. About half of what is born does not last the first week. Pika told me those numbers on the mat in the rain and did not blink at any of them. I need to be straight about my own limits before I go on, because this part of my life gets told as though I arrived with a specialty, and I did not. I am a trauma doctor. I have delivered 14 babies in my life, all of them by accident. What I know about it is what any emergency doctor knows. Wash, clean cloth, get the position right. Know what to do about bleeding afterwards. Know how to feel for feet when a child is coming wrong. That is roughly all of it. It turned out to be more than enough. And it turned out to be more than enough because the 3 things killing those women were all things you fix before you ever need a specialist. The first was infection. Unwashed hands, reed cloth off the floor, and a woman lying on a mat that had been slept on. Childbed fever, 4 or 5 days later, and nobody had ever connected the 2 events at all. The second was bleeding. A womb that has carried 6 does not close down afterwards as one that carried a single child does. If nobody rubs the belly hard and keeps rubbing it, the woman bleeds out on the mat in an hour. The third was position. 1 child in 6 or 7 comes at it wrong, and if there is nobody in the room who can put a hand in and find a foot, then that child dies and takes the mother with it. All 3 of those are solved by a trained person being in the room, which the custom forbade, which is why I spent the first birth of my second life sitting outside a reed wall in the dark, shouting. Ressa went into labor on the second evening after Pika first took me to that reed house, and Pika came and got me. The elders of the camp met me at the edge of the birth ground, and they were polite and they were completely immovable, and there were 9 of them. I could not go in. I did not fight about it, and I have thought since that if I had fought about it, I would have been walked out of that marsh, and Ressa would have died, and so would about 400 women after her. So I sent Pika in, and I sat down against the outside of the reed wall, close enough to hear breathing. I talked for 6 hours and 40 minutes, and she did every single thing with her own hands. Hands and forearms scrubbed at the pot outside before she went in, and again if she touched anything but the woman. Boiled cloth from the pot, carried in on a boiled board and not put on the ground for any reason. The first 3 came fast and easily, and none of them needed anything from anybody. Pika called out through the wall each time, and I heard her voice change on the third one because she had realized she was doing it correctly. The 4th came wrong. I heard her say so, and I heard Ressa's breathing change, and I put my forehead against the reed and told her exactly what to do, and what I told her was very simple, and it is not a secret. Wait for a gap, 1 hand, flat, slowly, and feel. If you find a foot, find the other foot. If you find only a back or a shoulder, tell me, and do not pull on anything at all until you have told me. She found 2 feet. She brought them together and she delivered that child the way it wanted to come. She said afterwards that the hardest part was doing it slowly, while a woman was screaming at her to hurry. The 5th was easy. The 6th was dead before it started, and had been for some days. I could tell that from outside the wall from the sound Pika made. There was never anything anybody could have done about that one. Then the bleeding started, and that is the part that would have killed Ressa in any other year of that camp's history, because bleeding after the last child is what 1 in 3 of those mothers actually dies of. I told Pika to put the heel of her hand on the top of the womb through the belly wall and push down and rub. Hard enough to hurt, and not to stop, and not to be talked out of it by anybody in the room. She did it for 40 minutes. Her arms gave out twice, and she changed hands and carried on. Ressa swore at her in 3 languages. The bleeding slowed, and then it stopped, and the womb came up under Pika's hand like a fist. Ressa lived. 5 of the 6 lived, and 4 of those 5 are alive now. One of them runs the apothecary at the 3rd clean house in the Marsh district, and has never once thanked me for anything, which is correct. Then I had the argument about the custom, and I did not win it with a speech. I won it with a wager, because a wager is the only argument I have ever seen change anything in this world. I asked the 9 elders how many of the last 30 births had cost the mother. They knew. Of course they knew. It is the sort of thing a camp of 160 people knows exactly, and the answer was 11. 11 mothers out of 30. I said it out loud twice, and I made them say it back, because they had known it forever, and had never once had it said as a single number in front of the whole camp. Then I made the offer. For 1 year, 1 trained woman of your own people is allowed inside, nobody else, and she washes and she brings boiled cloth. If the number is not better in a year, I never mention it again. It was not a hard sell after that. 2 of the 9 were against it at the end, and both of them held. One of them lost a daughter in the 8th month of that year, and did not change her position, and I respected that. The year came in at 31 births, and 2 mothers dead. 2 against an expected 11. I read both of those 2 names out at the winter reading, and I have them on the slate. And their names are Wen and Ilk. When Bled and Pika was 2 hours away at another birth and got there too late, Ilk had a fever on the 2nd day that I could not touch, the same fever I could not touch in Scylla and could not touch in Nib. I lost a 3rd that year, a man called Marn, and he is on the slate for a bad reason, which is that I set his forearm and closed it, and it healed, and then he died a month later of something in his chest I never identified. 9 names at the end of the 2nd year. I read all 9 out loud on the last night of it, in a reed house in a marsh, in front of about 30 people who had come to listen, and I hated that they had come to listen. The camp began to grow that year, and it did not stop. Fewer mothers dead, half as many infants lost, and 6 children a birth. Within 4 years, there were 400 goblins in that marsh, and they had to open a second camp. 12 years later, there are 19,000 of them across the Marsh district. The historians in Kettle call it a great flowering, and what it actually was is that somebody was allowed into the room with soap. Now the discovery that reorganized everything, and I made it out of pure frustration. It is the single most useful thing I found out in my whole second life. I cannot do fine work on a goblin. My hands are too big. I sewed a child's forearm with mountain weaver line meant for a giant, and the knots were bigger than the tissue, and I left 2 wounds open because I could not close them. Pika closed both, with my own needle, which was too big for her too, and she still did it better than I did. Her fingers are about half the size of mine, and she has a steadiness that I have never had and will never have. And then I thought about it properly, and it went the other way as well, and the other way is the more important half. Halda is a giant. Halda is an excellent operator. Halda cannot stitch a finger. She physically cannot. Her fingertip is wider than a goblin's whole forearm. She can open an abscess on a giant's palm faster and cleaner than I can. She can never in her life close a wound on a hand my size or smaller. So the work divides by hand size, and that is a fact of anatomy and not an opinion about anybody. And once you have seen it, you cannot run a school any other way. Giants for giants. Goblins for the fine work. Goblins for eyes and lips and fingers and children. Goblins for the inside of a joint. Goblins for anything where the difference between the wound edge and the knot matters, which is most of the delicate surgery there is. That is why the first proper surgical students I ever had were goblins. It was not charity and it was not politics. It was because they were better at it, and I said so out loud in front of the giants who were angry about it. Pika took the 3-wound examination on the last month of the 2nd year. Clean cut to close, dirty wound to lay open and drain, abscess to find and open. She passed all 3 at the first attempt. On the fine closure, she was better than I was. I said that in front of Halda and An and 4 others. I said it because a lie about that would have poisoned every faculty in the school before it existed. The thread came next, and it came out of the same problem. My silk was too thick, so I went to the weaver Rhoda and asked what else was up there, and Brack, who kept the Rhoda, already knew the answer. The caves along that band do not all produce the same line. The high dry caves make a coarser, stronger thread. 2 of the lower caves make a line about half the thickness, and it is what the weavers use for the inner web. So we stopped harvesting the band as one thing and started harvesting it as 2. We labeled them the heavy line and the fine line. Within 4 years, we were breeding for it, and within 7, there were 3 lines, where the count stood at the end of the 2nd year. 300 patients, 11 students, 6 of them goblins, 4 of them giants, and 1 of them a human runaway who had crossed the pass on his own with a pack and no letters. 9 names on the list, no houses, 11 students, and I was teaching them in a stone shed with the door off. On the last night of that year, Hulda pointed out that 4 of them had nowhere to sleep. I did not build a fortress. Note that, because every human account of what happened in those mountains says I built a stronghold, and what I actually built was 2 rooms, a shed, and a hole in the floor with a slope to it. The first clean house went up at the top of the pass in the second summer, and it took 14 weeks. It was the first thing giants and goblins had ever built together in the recorded history of either of them. They fought about where to put it for 12 days. Stone Step wanted it in Stone Step, which is reasonable because Stone Step had the pot, the shed, the trough, and 200 people who might need it in any given month. The Marsh wanted it in the Marsh, which is also reasonable because a goblin with a claw wound cannot walk 2 days over a ridge, and a giant with a claw wound can be carried over it by 4 of his friends in 12 hours. I settled it as everything in my life gets settled, which is with a stick in the dirt and a number. 9 hours from Stone Step to the pass, 12 hours from the Marsh to the pass, going hard. Nobody in either place is more than a day from the door. In a village with the pot at the far end of it, half the valley is 3 days away. The pass is worse for everyone and better for the sum, and the sum is the only thing that has ever mattered. A clean house is this, and the description is the reason there are 60 of them now, because it never changes, and it is deliberately dull. 2 rooms, not 1. The first room is for wounds that are clean, closures, fractures, and births. The second room is for anything already rotting, and nothing and nobody goes from the second room to the first without going through the pot. That is the 2-room law, and it is the only part of my system that is really a lie, in the sense that I never explained it. I could not explain it, so I made it a rule with a number attached, and nobody has ever broken it in front of me. A boiling shed outside with its own roof and its own fuel store, because a pot that goes off the boil because somebody ran out of wood has killed more people in this world than any spur beast. A floor of flagstone laid to a slope, with a channel at the low end running out through the wall. You can put 4 buckets of water down a floor like that, and it will be dry in an hour, and you can do it after every patient. Windows on the south side, big ones, because I need to see the color of a wound edge, and because in the first year at Stone Step, I did 2 operations by firelight, and I got both of them slightly wrong. A weighing trough, a store with a shelf for silk, and a shelf for cloth and nothing on the floor, a rack for the tool rolls, and a table by the door with the journal on it and a charcoal stick tied to the leg with silk. That is a clean house. Any 2 of my graduates and 20 strong people can build one in about 3 weeks out of local stone. There is nothing in it that anybody has to buy from me, and there never has been. Giants carried the stone. They walked it up from a slide below the tree line, 1 block at a time, and On shaped the door lintel himself, and it is still there, and it is still crooked. The goblins did everything that needed hands. The window frames, the roof, the channel through the wall, the thatch, the shelves, and the tool racks. A giant cannot cut a window frame. That had stopped being a controversial statement. The tool roll is the other half of the standard, and it matters more than the building. Every clean house has the same roll, in the same order. I set the order in the second year, and it has not moved since. 2 blades, 3 curved needles in 3 sizes, pincers, a blunt probe, 2 hollow bone drains, a screw tourniquet copied off a guild pattern, boiled cloth in a lidded box, soap, a hank each of heavy line and fine line. Same order, every roll, every house. When you reach for the small needle in the dark in a house you have never been in before, it is in the 3rd loop from the left, and it always is, and that has saved lives. The school was beside it, and the school was 1 long room with a fire and a floor you could wash. The admissions rule was 1 line, and I wrote it on the lintel: anyone with hands, not anyone with a family, not anyone with silver, not anyone with a race, a rank, a sponsor, a name, or a permission. Goblins, giants, humans who had walked out of the kingdom, and women in the same room as men. The last one sounds small, and it was not. 2 humans left over it in the first intake, and 1 of them came back in the 3rd year and worked under a goblin woman for 8 years and never mentioned it again. 41 people came for the first intake. 19 graduated. I will give you the 22 as well, because a school that only reports its graduates is lying, and I made that rule for myself first. 9 could not stop wetting thread in their mouths, no matter how many times they said the rules. 3 of those 9 came back the next year and passed, and one of them is now the head of a house in the orc clans. 4 could not work with the smell. That is not weakness, and I never treated it as weakness. There is a smell that comes off a 7-day-old wound, and about 1 person in 10 cannot be in a room with it. 2 fainted, both at the same operation, and one of them stayed on as a counter and is one of the best counters alive, because you can watch a chest rise and fall without looking at the wound. 5 went home. Their reasons were their own, and most of them were about food and family. 2 of them opened washing sheds in their own villages with no exam and no license, and that was fine with me. And 2 I sent away. And those 2 are the reason the school has a rule with no appeal. It happened in the 9th week, and it decided the shape of everything afterwards. They had written up a wound in the journal as clean when it had not been clean. Not to hurt anybody, to avoid an argument with me at the end of a long day. The patient did badly, and the journal said the wound had been fine. I struck both of them off in front of the whole intake. Not for the outcome, for the entry. I told them, and I have told 900 people since, that I can work with a bad result and I cannot work with a false line. The journal is not for me. It is for the person standing over this patient in 4 days when I am on the other side of the pass. If the journal lies, that person is operating blind and does not know it. Yun arrived in the 11th week of that first intake. I did not recognize him, because the last time I had seen him, he had been 12 years old and had given me a stick and a heel of bread. He was 15. He had walked over the pass on his own with a pack, which nobody from Low Hollow had done in living memory. He came into the long room and pulled his trousers down to the knee without saying anything. There was a white line down the outside of his right thigh as long as my hand, with a row of faint marks either side of it, and a small round scar at the low end of it where a boiled wheat straw had been. The whole intake looked at it, 41 people, half of whom had never met a human. The first thing they were shown as evidence that any of this works was a 7-year-old scar on a herd boy's leg. He told me the rest that night. Osgar with the draining shin died in the 4th year. Sarah, whose foot came off in the square, keeps a house on the mill lane now. Her sister Hesta still has the finger. Brother Ham is still at the chapel and has never once repeated the test he did on Osgar's leg. And Mara had a bad chest for 2 winters and is well now and had sent me a jar of honey which had broken in the pack. And Tavis Cray came back to Low Hollow 3 times, not to ask about me. Every single time, he asked whether the boy with the thigh was still walking. The 3rd time he asked to see the scar, and Mara would not let him. Yun could read and write, because his father had been a tally man before he died, and Mara had kept the letters going. That made him the most valuable person in the building, and it had nothing to do with his hands. Human hands are the wrong size for goblin surgery, and the wrong size for giant surgery. I have said that in public often enough that people think I dislike my own species. Human hands are the right size for humans. But the journals are the spine of everything, and Yun ran them. He copied the 5 rules onto boards for the marsh camps. He wrote out the tool roll order. He built the index of every case in that house for 3 years. He is not the best surgeon that school ever produced. He is the reason we can prove anything at all about the ones who were. He runs the journals of the Western houses now with 16 people under him. The 19 graduated at the end of the 3rd summer. Then they left, and that is the moment I stopped being the story. I did not send them out. I could not have stopped them. 19 people who could open an abscess, wash a wound, put in a drain, close in layers, set a fresh fracture, and refuse a bad job walked out over 4 passes. 4 went into the marsh. 3 stayed at the pass. 2 went east to Highfall, the place where a hunter lost an arm to somebody who had heard half of it. 2 went into the low valleys where I had never been. And 8 went out with instructions to find a village that would give them a floor and to build the 2 rooms and to write down every single patient and to send the journal to the pass twice a year. That is the growth, and there is nothing magical anywhere in the engine of it. 1 man treats 42 patients in 2 months. 19 people treat about 900 in a year without me touching one of them. The count at the end of the 3rd summer, 900 patients on the journals, mine and theirs together, 19 graduates, 1 clean house, 21 names in the ledger, 12 of them added that year. 12 in a year, and 10 of the 12 were people brought in too late. 1 of them was a woman in the 2nd room at the pass, whose fever I could not touch, and I have never been able to touch it since. I was standing at the door of that house on the last morning of the summer, watching On argue with a goblin about a shelf, when the lookout on the ridge started shouting and did not stop. There were orcs on the north road, not 2, not a trade party of 4 with hides, about 60 of them with axes and a standard, coming up the pass at a walk, and they had not sent anybody ahead to ask. 60 orcs came up the north road to the pass in the 3rd autumn. Their chief walked into my clean house, looked at a goblin closing a hand wound, and told me that I was in the business of theft. Gar Hammer was about my height, plus a head, and built like the doorframe, and he was in constant pain. I knew that before he opened his mouth because I watched him get up the last 20 steps. 3 old fractures. Left forearm, healed with a bow in it. Right collarbone, healed with a lump you could see through his shirt, and a shoulder that could not lift above the horizontal. Right shin, healed short. The forearm was about 13 years old, the collarbone about 8, and the shin about 15. He had walked on that shin for 15 years, and it was 2 fingers shorter than the other one, and that had wrecked his hip. He had not come to be treated. He had come because the story had reached his clans. The story as it reached them was that a human at the pass had found a way to take the price out of a wound, and to an orc, that is not a medical rumor. That is an accusation. So he had brought 60 axes up a road to look at it, if it was true, to say out loud in front of his people that no clan of his would use it. Their code needs laying out properly, because every human account of orcs is written by people who were being hit at the time. The code is not stupid, and it is not bloodlust. A raid costs. Somebody pays for what the clan takes. The scar is the receipt. A warrior with a closed shoulder and a straight arm walking around after a raid where 2 men died is a man walking around with an unpaid bill. Being treated is not cowardice to them. It is fraud. It is trying to get the meat without the price. That is a coherent moral position held by about 40,000 people, and I was not going to talk them out of it. So I did not argue with it. I have not once tried to argue a people out of their own code in 12 years. The 2 or 3 times I forgot that rule, I lost a district for a year. What I did was take their code and hold it up the other way round. It took me 1 afternoon and 1 question, and the question was about who the price is actually paid to. I asked Gar who the receipt is for. He said the clan. I asked him what the clan actually gets out of a warrior who rots for 3 months and then loses an arm, and he told me honestly that it gets nothing. Then I asked him the other half of it, what the clan gets out of a warrior who is back in the line in 2 weeks with a stiff shoulder and a scar the length of my hand. He did not answer that, so I answered it, with a number off his own tally. Because his people count too. Every clan has a talker who keeps the roll of the dead, and I asked for theirs, and I got it. It was worse than Dorn's board, by a factor I could not believe when I first heard it. Of the men who came home wounded from a raid, about half were still alive and whole a year later. A quarter were dead of the rot. A quarter were alive and missing something, which in an orc clan means a life on the wall. I said, your scar is not the price. The rot is the price, and the rot is paid to nobody. It does not go to the clan. It does not go to the dead men. It does not go to your gods. It goes into the ground. Then I said the only line of that whole conversation that I planned in advance. I am not proud of it, because it is a debating trick, and it worked. I asked him what he would call a clan that paid a tax to nobody. He would not accept it. He said that any weakling could raid if the wound cost nothing. That is a real objection, and it deserved an answer. The answer is that the wound still costs everything except the rot. You still get opened up. It still hurts, and I said that plainly. And I told him that a man in my second room is in more pain for 12 days than a man who packs a wound and lies down and dies in 5 weeks. He said we would settle it in the spring, and I said no, we would settle it with a count. I offered him the wager on the spot in front of about 80 people, and he took it because a chief cannot refuse a count. The terms. After the next raid, I get 20 of the wounded, chosen by his talker and not by me. He keeps 20, treated the old way, by his own people, with pitch and prayer and time. 1 month, then we count. He added a term of his own, and I accepted it because I had no choice, and because it was fair. If more of his 20 were alive and whole than mine, my house at the pass came down, and I went back over the human pass. The raid came in the 11th week of winter, and it was not on me, and I want to be honest about my discomfort with that. The Hammer clans went down onto the barony of Ven and burned 2 grain stores and came back. I have never resolved what I think about that. I treated 40 men who had been hurt, taking food out of a human district by force. 12 years later, I treated the barony's own soldiers in the same room off the same pot. The best I have is what I said to Gar's talker at the time, which is that the order is by wound and not by side, that I would take his enemies wounded ahead of him if his enemies' wounds were worse. He wrote it down. Orcs write. Everybody assumes they do not, and their talkers keep better rolls than the Guild of Bonesetters does, which I found out later in a way that mattered enormously. 40 wounded came back up the North Road. His talker split them 20 and 20, and he split them fairly. If anything, he gave me the worse half because 2 of mine had belly wounds and none of his did. 25 days later, we counted in front of both clans, and the count is the reason there are 17 orc clean houses now and a bone faculty with 140 students in it. My 20, 19 alive, 1 dead, a man called Skarn with a belly wound that I could not do anything about. I told them on the first day that he would die, and I told them why, and he did on the 4th. Of the 1918 kept everything they came in with. 1 lost a hand, and I took it myself on the 2nd day, because it had been crushed between a wall and a beam, and there was nothing left in it to save. I made a point of that hand. I stood in front of both clans and held up the saw, Tavis Cray's saw, and said that this was mine, and that I use it, that I had used it that month, and that the cutting is not the enemy. His 20, 11 alive, 9 dead over 25 days, 7 of them of the rot in the 3rd and 4th week, which is exactly the shape you see when a wound is sealed instead of drained. And of the 11 alive, 4 had lost something. 2 arms above the elbow, 1 leg below the knee, 1 hand. Taken by their own people in the way they have always taken them, in the 4th week, too late. 19 and 1 against 11 and 4. I did not say a word after the numbers were read. I have learned that the number does the work and that anything I add on top of a number weakens it. Gar Hammer stood up in front of his own clan and paid the wager, and he paid it in full. It took him a long time to get through it, and it was the most difficult thing I ever watched anybody in Ordained do. He said, I have been wrong for 30 years, and every man on the wall in my hall is on the wall because I was wrong. There are 4 more of them today, and I put them there myself with this bet. Then he said my name. He said, Mark Hale will take my clan's wounded, and any man who calls that theft will say it to me. And then he sat down, and nobody in that hall said anything for a while. Afterwards, he came outside and found me at the pot and asked me, quietly, with nobody else in earshot, whether I could straighten his shin. That is the first thing he had asked me for. That was for himself. I could not. That is the part of this that I have to keep telling people, because the story that goes around is that I fixed the chief and won the clans. 15 years is too long for that bone in that place. I told him the truth in front of everybody, which is that I could break it and pull it straight and he would probably keep the leg and he would never walk as well as he did last week, and that I would not do it. His collarbone I could not touch either. His forearm I could have improved and did not, because he needed that hand for the next 10 years, and the operation was long and the gain was small. What I did do was give him a built-up boot for the short leg, which a goblin made in 2 days out of hide and cork. It took about 1/3 of the pain out of his hip, and he wore that boot until he died. He asked me why I had not lied to him about the shin. I said because his talker writes things down, and a man whose talker writes things down will find out. Then nothing I ever say to him will work again. Now the part where I was wrong. And it was one of the 2 or 3 most useful times I have ever been wrong. I found it out in the 2nd week of the wager while I was working on his 20. Orcs are the best bone setters in the world, not the guild, not me, not the giants who have no fine control, and not the goblins who do not have the mass to pull against a big bone. They have been reducing fractures and dislocations by hand for generations, because they have to, because a raiding people cannot carry cripples. Every clan has 2 or 3 people whose whole life is that skill. Ulda was the Hammer clan's setter. She was about 50 and shorter than me, and she had forearms like On's, and she had been putting bones back since she was 14, and her mother had done it before her. I watched her reduce a dislocated shoulder in about 4 seconds. I watched her do a hip, which is a thing I have needed 3 people and a table for at home, with 1 knee, 1 foot, and a rope. She could feel a fracture line through the muscle of an arm the size of my leg and tell me which way the far end had gone. I cannot do that. I could not do it after 4 years of watching her, and I still cannot. What she did not have was a boiled blade, a drain, a thread that holds, and a way to put a screaming man to sleep for the hour it takes to open a limb and clean it. That is all she was missing. So Ulda got the bones, and I mean that in the institutional sense. When we built the faculty, she wrote the fracture teaching, and I wrote nothing in it at all. The 14 pages she dictated are still the text. 3 clean houses in 3 clans in that year, plus the marsh house, plus the pass. 5. Built to the same plan out of local stone, with the same tool roll and the same journal and a boiling shed on the same side of the door. 60 students when the 4th year closed, 31 of them orcs. Every single one of the orcs was better with a fracture on the day they arrived than I was on the day I stopped operating. 3,000 patients in the journals. And here is the number that got harder that year. The reason it got harder was a decision I made in the winter and have never regretted for a moment. 21 names in the ledger at the end of the 3rd summer, and 60 at the end of the 4th. That is not because I lost 39 people with my own hands. I lost 4 that year. The other 35 were lost in houses I have never worked in, by graduates I had taught, in valleys 2 weeks walk away. I put them on my slate because the alternative was that nobody would. A house that reports its own dead to itself will round. A school that only counts what the founder loses is a school that has told 60 people their failures do not go in the book, so every house sends its dead by name. They come in twice a year with the journals. Yun copies them onto the boards, and I read them out when the year closes. The number is always worse than the number I feel, and that is exactly the point of it. 60 names, 3,000 patients, 60 students, 5 houses. At the end of the 4th summer, Gar Hammer came back up the North Road with 11 young orcs and a wagon and no axes at all. He put them in a line in front of the school door and told me he was not asking me to take them. He said he was informing me that the clans were sending 11 a year from now on, and that Ulda was coming with them. Then he told me what he wanted in exchange, and it was not silver, and it was not peace. It took him 1 sentence, and he had clearly been working on it the whole way up the road. He said, "My people will not be students in your house. Give the bones their own roof, their own teacher, and their own name on the door, or send these 11 home with me tonight." Gar Hammer got his roof. The bone faculty went up on the north side of the school in the 5th spring with Ulda's name cut into the lintel above the door, and mine is not on it and never has been. That was the year I stopped being a surgeon who taught and became a man who traveled around looking at other people's floors. I resented it for about 4 months, and then I understood what I was actually for. Giving the orcs their own roof was the best thing I did that year. I did it grudgingly, and I was wrong to be grudging. A separate faculty is not a concession to pride. It is how a craft keeps its own standards. Ulda taught fractures her way. Her students bowed to her and not to me. They marked their own examinations. The pass rate in bones was lower than mine because she failed people I would have passed. She sent one of her own nephews home. He could set a bone, and he could not be made to boil for a full 300. She failed him twice and then told him to go and be a smith, and she was right, and I would have hesitated. That is what a faculty is. Somebody who knows more than the founder about one thing, with the power to say no in their own name. 900 graduates later, that is the only reason the standard did not rot. The kobolds came in the 5th summer, and they came because of a fire in a mine 3 days west. The first one through the door was carried in by 4 of his own people on a plank. Chi was about 1.20 meters, and he had been holding a lamp when something in a seam let go. Both his hands and both forearms were burned in a way I had not seen since a chemical spill at home. Not a flame burn. Something in that rock was in the burn and was still working in it. I washed those arms with boiled water for 2 hours straight, which is all anybody can do about that. He kept both hands. He lost the tips of 3 fingers, and he has claws instead of a left thumb pad, and he cannot do fine work of any sort. He told me on the 4th day that this made him useless to his own people. Then he asked me what was in the jar I had been using on him, and I told him I did not know. He asked me who had made it, and I said a goblin in a marsh, and he said, "Then who checks it?" That question built the apothecary. Chi could not hold a needle again, and he ran the medicine of an empire for the next 8 years, and the thing he brought was not a substance. It was the idea of a labeled jar. Kobold's mine. That means kobolds know rock, and salts, and what dissolves in what, and which of it burns you. They had 17 words for kinds of dust, and I had 1, and every one of their words mattered. Within a year, Chi had the hoodwort tested and marked on a written standard instead of on my memory. Every batch, 2 numbers, the date it was drawn, the marsh it came from, and the initials of whoever tested it. He worked out that the strength changes with the season the root is pulled in. Nobody knew that. Tup's people had always known that autumn root was strong, in the way you know the weather, and nobody had ever written it against a date. Autumn root, marked. Spring root, marked, and about half as strong and worth having precisely because half strength is what you want for a child's tooth. A weak jar stopped being a bad jar and became a different jar. Then he did the willow bark, and the gray ointment, and a resin salve for burns, and a wash for eyes. He did all of it the same way, which is that nothing left his shed without 2 numbers and a date on it. I gave him one rule and he improved it. My rule was that an unmarked jar is not medicine. His rule, which is the one in force now, is that an unmarked jar is emptied out in front of the person who brought it in. The Marshkin came in the autumn and they came about something I could not fix. They stayed because of something they could do that nobody else on the continent could do. They live in the low wet country south of the marsh. They had a rot that got into the skin of the feet and the folds of the body and would not stop. I looked at it for 19 days and got nowhere useful. It is not a wound. It is not an abscess. There is nothing to open and nothing to drain, and boiling does not reach it because it is not in one place. Every one of my 4 technologies is aimed at the wrong target. Sora was the one who came to negotiate, and she watched me fail for 19 days. On the 20th, she told me that her people had never expected me to fix it and had come for something else entirely. They wanted the sleep and the thread for injuries, and in exchange, they offered the one thing I had been quietly failing at for 4 years, which is keeping a wound dry in air that is not dry. I had built the pass house with south windows and a sloped floor, and I thought I understood drying. In the marsh, in the wet season, my dressings came off damp, and my second room smelled, and my journals went soft. Sora's people build a drying room. 2 openings, low and high, on the sides the wind actually comes from, with a channel of coals along one wall, and racks that stand a hand clear of everything. They know how to build a latrine that does not talk to a well. They knew it as a rule of thumb about slope and distance without any theory under it, and I took their rule and never improved it. They know that cloth put away damp is ruined cloth. They had a laundry method with a hot rack and a beating frame that got a dressing drier than mine in half the time, in worse weather. So sanitation went to the Marshkin, and it is theirs still, in all 60 houses. They set the water rule, the latrine rule, the laundry rota, and the drying rack standard. They enforce it, and they fail houses over it. The humans who came to me in those years were mostly people running away from something, and the useful ones were not surgeons at all. They were clerks, and I had been badly short of clerks for 4 years. 2 runaway chapel scribes, a tallyman's widow, a barony clerk who had been dismissed for reading the accounts too carefully, and a man who had copied law for 20 years and could write for 6 hours without stopping. Yun put them to work, and what came out of it was the book. Not a holy book, a copying job. Everything the school knew in order, in one volume, in language, a person with no letters could have read to them out loud. The 5 rules first, in the words they are chanted in. The tool roll, in order, with a drawing. The 2-room law, the boiling count, the weighing trough, with the bucket table for giants, orcs, goblins, humans, and kobolds. The 3 sleep rules, the batchmarking standard, dictated by Chi. Ulda's 14 pages on fractures. Pika's 4 pages on births, which are better than anything I could have written. The drying room from Sora. And at the back, the thing that made the copyists mutter, which is the ledger format. Every house keeps its dead by name and sends them to the pass twice a year. The last page of the book is a blank example of that page. 11 copies in the 5th year, each one handwritten, each one taking a copyist about 7 weeks. 211 copies now. I have never sold one, and I have not once refused one to anybody who asked. That was the year the numbers stopped being mine and started being the network's. They belong here properly, because this is the year the shape of the whole thing became visible. 16 clean houses, 14 of them small, 2 rooms and a shed, run by 1 graduate and 2 or 3 local people, 2 of them large, at the pass and in the marsh, with a faculty, a store, and a resident apothecary. 130 students in training. 9,000 patients through all 16 houses in that year alone. The largest single group in that 9,000 was not wounds, it was births. 40 carriers under Garda, which was the 5th thing built and the least glamorous. Stretchers of a standard length. Water on the route. Tents. A rule about how many carry a giant and from which side you lift. Garda had 1 arm and a scar she showed to anybody who asked, and she ran that service like a quartermaster. She failed 2 carriers in the first year for going to a wounded chief ahead of a wounded child. And 140 names entered by hand, coming in twice a year in other people's handwriting, from houses I had never stood in. I read all of them out at the winter reading, and it took most of an hour. I did about 7 operations in that whole year. That is the change that mattered, and it took me months to stop fighting it. Because I am a surgeon, and standing in a doorway watching somebody else work is a physical discomfort. What I did instead was ride. Garda carried me for the first 2 years, and then I got a mountain pony that hated me. I went round the houses, and I looked at 4 things in every single one of them. The floor, at the low end by the channel, with a wet hand. The pot, and how long the count actually was, done by me out loud, while somebody stood there and sweated. The store, for thread on the floor. And the journal. The journal always last, and the journal for longest. Anybody can boil water for 300 while the founder is in the room. Only a house that is honest all year has a journal that reads like an honest year. I caught things. A house in the low valleys was counting to 300 at about twice the proper speed, which their graduate demonstrated to me cheerfully, without any idea that she was doing it wrong. I stood in that shed and counted with her for an hour until her count and mine were the same. Then I made her teach it to her 2 helpers, and then I made her write the incident in her own journal in her own hand. Another house had a jar of hoodwort with no mark on it, and I emptied it into the channel in front of everybody, which is cheese rule and not mine. It cost that house a fortnight of no bone work, and they never did it again. But here's the thing that bothered me all through that year of riding around, and I could not put my finger on it at the time. It turned out to be the single most important thing I noticed in 5 years. Every house was perfect when I got there. The floors were wet, the counts were slow and correct, the stores were tidy, the journals were up to date, and everybody had put on a clean shirt. They knew I was coming. Of course they knew. I sent word ahead because I am not a monster, and because a house needs to know whether to expect a bed and a meal. And so every inspection I did for 5 years was a performance. I wrote a note to myself about it in the winter of the 5th year, and then I did nothing about it for 2 more years. 6 people died to teach me the lesson I had already written down in my own hand. The last thing that happened that year happened in the low valleys, at the smallest house we had, run by a graduate called Cell, with 2 helpers and a floor she had laid herself. 4 humans came in over the Barony Road, well-dressed for that country, well-fed, with a good horse between them and no injuries of any kind. They stayed 3 days and were extremely polite. They watched a birth from the doorway, with permission. They watched Cell open an abscess. They asked what the counting was for and were told the truth and wrote it down and asked her to repeat it twice. And they drew everything. The floor plan, the slope of the channel, the rack, the boiling shed and which side of the door it was on. The tool roll laid out in order with the loops numbered. All of it. Cell let them. She let them because I had told her the method is free and belongs to anybody who wants it. She was doing exactly what I had told her to do, and she sent me a letter about it 2 weeks later. The letter said the men had been paid to draw, that they had asked her 7 times where the potion was kept, that when she said there was no potion, the oldest of them had smiled and written that down too. In the 6th year, the kingdom of Marnhold worked out what I was doing. The answer they arrived at was that I had a healing potion of the highest grade, probably stolen, possibly from a demon. That is not stupidity either, and I am tired of hearing it called stupidity. In Ordain, miracles are real. Priests close wounds with their hands. There are dragons on the south coast, and there are gods who answer. In a world like that, a cure that works every time and can be repeated by a stranger in a shed is obviously an object. It is a thing in a bottle. Any other explanation would have been the unreasonable one. And there was money underneath it, and the money belongs on the table before I tell you what they did, because the money explains all 3 attempts, and none of them make sense without it. The Guild of Bone Setters takes 8 silver for a limb. That is the charter rate, and it has not moved in 90 years. On top of that comes the crutch, from the master's own cart, and the poppy draft for the month. Oren Vask was guild master in Marnhold in those years, and Oren Vask kept better accounts than any king. About 11,000 limbs a year across the kingdom in the years before I turned up. 8 silver each, plus about 3 in crutches and legs of wood, plus the poppy, which is the part nobody thinks about and which is the most profitable part, because a man on the poppy stays on the poppy. The guild also owns the school that licenses the masters and takes a cut of every license and holds the contract for the army's field cutters, and Vask had a house in the capital with a stone stair. Against that, my price: a pot of water, soap that every household in the world already makes, thread that 4 giants cut off a cliff for nothing, account to 300, which is free. Vask was not defending a belief. He was defending an income of about 140,000 silver a year. I have never once thought of him as a fanatic, and that is precisely what made him dangerous. They tried 3 things in that year, and all 3 of them hurt me more than the war did 4 years later, and the war involved 11,000 men. The first was theft, and for about 4 months it was almost funny. It stopped being funny in a barony court in the autumn when a man was hanged for handing over exactly what he had been sent to steal. I was riding the low valleys at the end of the summer, and I slept in a barn outside a village called Ross Ford. In the night, somebody took my bag out from under my head and did it well enough that I slept through it. I lost 19 days of journal notes, and I lost a needle I liked. I was more annoyed about the notes. I did not report it to anybody because there was nobody to report it to, and I bought a new needle in the marsh. What was in the bag? In full, because it matters, and because the inventory was read out in a barony court 4 months later, and read out badly. 1 curved needle, brass, ground by a goblin in a boiled cloth. 2 straight needles. A blunt bone hook for holding a wound edge open, made from a spur beast rib. 3 hanks of silk, 1 heavy, 1 fine, 1 quick. 1 flask of grain spirit, distilled twice, for the needles and for nothing else, because I have never once in 12 years poured spirit into an open wound, and I will fight anybody who says otherwise. 1 cake of ash soap, wrapped. 1 hollow bone tube. 4 clean cloths, boiled and folded. A charcoal stick, a slate the size of my hand, and my tool roll in the standard order, 3rd loop from the left. There is no potion in that bag. There was never a potion in that bag. There is nothing in that bag that a competent village in this world could not make in an afternoon out of things it already owns. The man who stole it was called Dole, and he had been paid in advance by an agent of somebody I never identified. He was hanged for fraud in the 11th week of the autumn, not for theft, for fraud. His employer opened the bag, found a needle and a bar of soap and a bag of spider thread, and concluded that Dole had swapped the contents and sold them elsewhere. Dole told the court the bag was exactly as he had taken it. That is the truth, and he died for telling it. He is not on my slate, because my slate is for people I failed to keep alive with my own 2 hands, and he was not my patient. I have thought about that decision for 6 years. I still think it is right, and I still do not like it. Every time I read the slate out, I stop at the year 6 section and think about a man I never met. The second attempt was the one that broke something in me. It happened in the 9th month of that year, and the name is Vetch. Vetch was a goblin. 19, second intake, passed the 3 wounds at the first attempt, better at fine closure than anybody except Pika. He was traveling east with a copy of the book to open a house at Elo. Elo is in Baron Ven's country. He was picked up on the road by the Baron's men with the book on him and taken to the house because the Baron's younger brother had a leg wound and had been given 3 days. 6 days old, a boar hunt, thigh wound, packed and closed by a priest of the light on the 2nd day, hot to the hip. I have treated that injury 400 times with a blade, a pot, and a hollow piece of bone. They asked Vetch for the potion. He did not have a potion, so he told them the truth, entirely, and he told it well because he was a good student and he had the book on the table in front of him. He told them to boil water for a count of 300, to wash their hands and forearms with soap before touching the man, and after, to open the closed wound, which they would not like, and wash it until the water ran clear, to put a drain in the low end, to leave the low end open, not to seal it, to weigh the patient, to have one man sit at his head and count his breathing out loud, and to stop everything if the count changed. Now hear it as the room heard it. There is a lord dying in a bed. A goblin the size of a child has been brought in from the road and has told the family in front of the priest that the cure is to wash their hands. They thought he was mocking them, not lying to protect a secret, mocking, that the guild's own master had come and the church had come. The answer this creature offered a dying nobleman was soap and account. The Baron had him questioned for 2 days to get the true answer out of him. I am not going to describe those 2 days because I do not know the details and because inventing them would be obscene. He never changed a word of it. He said the same 5 lines at the end that he said at the beginning. And then they hanged him for lying to a lord's face while the lord's brother was dying, and the brother died 4 days later. Of the wound. Of exactly what I said, in exactly the way I said. There is a physician's note in the Elo records that says the leg had gone bad above the closure, and the priest wrote the will of the light. They kept the book. Somebody in that house had the sense not to burn it. It went into a chest in a country house, and it stayed shut in that chest for 6 years. I heard about it a month later from a hide trader who had heard it from a groom. It took me 16 days to confirm it, and I confirmed it in the end from the barony's own court roll, copied out by a clerk we paid. I wrote Vetch's name on the slate, on the same list, in the same column, as the patients I have lost. He was not my patient, he was my student. I put him there anyway, and I did not consult anybody about it. The reason is simple, and I said it out loud at the reading. Every other name on that slate is somebody who died because the method reached them too late. Vetch died because the method reached them at all. If the school ever decides that only patients count, then the next Vetch is a cost of doing business. The school will start sending 19-year-olds down roads without asking who owns the road. We changed the rules that winter, and the changes were not brave. Nobody travels into a human barony alone. Nobody travels with the book. Copies go by trader and by separate route. Anybody may refuse the journey. The third attempt came in the spring at the end of that year, and it came with a chest. It is the one that people in Kettle still laugh about, and I have never found it funny for 1 minute. An embassy, 9 riders, a chest, a herald, and an envoy called Price with a chain of office and a very good grasp of the situation, who I liked, and who I would probably have liked over dinner. The chest was silver. I did not count it, and he told me the number, and I have no reason to think he lied. It was more coin than the entire kingdom had ever paid for anything that was not a war. He wanted the recipe. He was authorized to buy it outright, with a title, with land in the West, with a pardon for the sorcery judgment at Low Hollow, and with a license to practice anywhere in Marnhold. I said yes, immediately. In front of his 9 riders, my 4 faculty heads, 20 students, Garda, about 30 people who had come to look at the horses, which is the largest crowd I have ever stood in front of. I told him the price was nothing, not a reduced price, nothing. And then, because I did not trust him to carry it accurately, I said the whole thing out loud on the spot and had Yun write it down twice. The 5 rules, in the words they are chanted in. The 2-room law, the boiling count and how to time it, the weighing trough, the 3 sleep rules, where the silk comes from, and how to stop burning the caves. I offered him 2 graduates, at my cost, for 2 years, to build the first house in Marnhold and train the first 20 people. I offered to take 20 of his subjects into the school that autumn, free, fed, housed. He wrote none of it down. His clerk wrote it down. Price sat there with his hands on his knees and let me finish, and then asked me the question that told me the whole thing was already over. He waited until his clerk had put the pen down, and then he asked me with real patience, in front of everybody, what the price actually was. He was not being sarcastic, and that is the terrible part. I said there was not one. He said that he had been sent to conclude a purchase, and that he could not go home to a chancellor with a report that said the greatest treasure in the world had been given away for free. And then he explained it to me, and he was doing me a kindness, and he was right about his own country. He said, if it is free, it is not a treasure. If it is not a treasure, then the boy at Elo was hanged for nothing. He said, if the guild is wrong, then 11,000 limbs a year for 90 years were taken off people who did not need to lose them, and no crown in the world can survive saying that out loud. Then he made one last attempt, and I have thought about this more than about the chest. He asked me to name any price at all, however strange, so that he could take a price home. Anything I wanted. So I named one. I said, strike the per limb fee out of the guild charter. Pay a bone setter a wage, the same wage, whether he takes the limb off or washes it out and keeps it on. That is my whole price. He sat with that for a while, and then he told me quite gently that I had not named a price. I had named a law. That he could buy a secret and he could not buy the way a kingdom pays its tradesmen. The chest went back down the pass with the 9 riders. Price shook my hand and told me he hoped I would be alive in 10 years, which I have thought about since, and which I do not think was a threat. Where the numbers stood in the 6th year, 25 clean houses, 240 students, 20,000 patients recorded across the network in that year, of which about 5,000 were births. And 300 names on the slate. I read all 300 out loud in the long room on the last night of that year. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes, and I got to vetch about halfway through and read it flat. 300 against 20,000. That is a ratio I would have taken proudly at home. I read it out anyway, every name, every year, because the ratio is not the point, and the ratio has never been the point. Then, 16 days into the 7th year, a journal came in from the house on the Great Road at Hollow Bridge, and Yun brought it to me before he had finished copying it, and he had a bad look on his face. 6 deaths in 1 month, in one house, out of 61 patients, in a house that had run for 2 years at about 1 death in 40. And the house was ours, and the graduate who ran it had passed all 3 wounds first time. The most dangerous enemy I ever had was not the guild, and it was not a baron. It was a graduate of my own school called Corin Ash. He killed 6 people with a shortcut, and about a third of it was my fault. Hollow Bridge sits on the Great Road, where it crosses out of the barony country into the low valleys. It is the busiest place any of our houses had ever stood, and that is exactly why it went wrong. Corin was human, 26, third intake. He passed the 3 wounds at the first attempt. He was better at a closure than most of the giants, and he had a good manner with frightened people, and I liked him. He went out to Hollow Bridge in the 5th year with 2 helpers and built the 2 rooms himself in 19 days. For 2 years, that house ran at about 1 death in 40 patients, which is a good house. Then he discovered something that none of our other houses had discovered, because none of our other houses were on a road with money on it, and what he discovered was that people will pay. Not the locals, the traffic. A wool merchant with a crushed foot, kept and walking in 3 weeks, will put silver on the table without being asked, and a merchant who is going to lose a foot will put a lot of silver on it. I had never forbidden that. There is no rule in the book about it, and there was not one until the 8th year. I had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that nobody would want money badly enough. So he took it, and then he did the thing that anybody who has ever run anything will recognize instantly, which is that once income exists, costs start to look like waste. 1 hank of fine line used on 1 patient closes 1 wound and gets thrown out when the ends are too short. Used carefully across 3 patients, it closes 3 wounds, and there is your thread bill cut by 2/3. A pot at a rolling boil for a count of 340 times a day burns a startling amount of wood, and wood on the Great Road is bought and not cut. A count of 100 looks identical and costs 1/3, and a breath counter is a person. A person who sits at a patient's head and says numbers, who eats, who sleeps in the storeroom, who takes a share, and who does nothing that a passing merchant can see the value of. So we let the counter go and used the thread 3 times and counted to 100. For about 7 months, he got away with all of it, and then in 1 month, he lost 6 people out of 61. Yun brought me the journal on the 16th day of the 7th year, and I rode to Hollow Bridge myself, and it took me 12 days, and Garda came, and Pika came, and I did not send word ahead. That was the first unannounced visit I ever made in my life, and I only made it because I was too angry to write a letter. It turned into the 2nd most important institution in the empire. The house looked good. That is the thing I need people to understand about how this happens. The floor was dry, the store was tidy, the rack was up, the 5 rules were on a board by the door, freshly painted. The journal was up to date, and it was beautifully written, and every one of the 6 deaths in it was recorded as brought too late. Then I went out to the boiling shed and looked at the wood pile. The wood pile was too big for a house that had been boiling properly for 7 months, and that is how I caught it. I sat down with the journal for 4 hours and read the 61 cases backwards. The 6 of them are in front of me in my memory in a way that 380 other names are not. A carter's wife called Neve, 6 children before, 7th birth, and Corin delivered her himself in the first room with hands he had washed at the start of the morning, and not since, because he had seen 4 patients in between. She died on the 5th day with the fever I cannot touch. The journal says brought too late. She was not brought at all. She lived 400 paces from the door, and she walked in on her own legs. A boy of 9 called Tam, cartwheel over the lower leg, open wound, dirt in it, closed without a drain, and closed all the way to the bottom end, because a drain means a follow-up visit, and follow-up visits cost days. He died on the 9th day. The journal says brought too late. The journal in Corin's own hand 3 lines earlier says the wound was clean when he closed it, and both of those things cannot be true. A man called Ivor Sull, a drover, arm crushed under a beam, put to sleep for the operation with a jar that was correctly marked, by a graduate who was working alone with 2 helpers and no counter at the head. He stopped breathing on the table. Nobody was watching his chest, because the only 2 other people in the room were holding the arm and holding the lamp, and Corin was inside the arm where I would have been. That is Brog. That is exactly Brog 6 years later, in a house with a book on the shelf that has the 3 sleep rules written on page 11, and it happened because a counter eats food. 3 more. A woman with an abscess opened with a blade that had been in the pot for a count of 100. 2 men closed with the 3rd pass of a hank of fine line, both of whom went bad along the stitch line in 4 days. I held the first court of the School of Clean Hands in the long room at the pass 41 days later. There were about 200 people in it, and every faculty head sat at the front, and it lasted 2 days. Corin defended himself. He did it well, and he did not lie once in 2 days. I want to put his defense in properly, because the version people tell in Kettle now has him as a thief, and he was not a thief. He said the house at Hollowbridge had no money. True. He said the school had sent him 2 helpers, a tool roll, 4 hanks of line a year, and no coin at all, ever, in 2 years. Also true. He said that fuel on the Great Road costs 7 times what it costs at the pass. That in the 2nd winter, he had run out of wood in the 4th month and had boiled with green timber and been ashamed of it. He said that he had written to me twice about the thread ration and had received a reply from the store telling him to use his allocation carefully. He produced the reply. It exists. It is signed by a clerk we employed. He said, "You gave me a standard and no way to pay for it. Then you sent word 2 weeks before you visited so that I could always find the wood for the week you were there." That last one landed on me in front of 200 people, and it was accurate. I had written the same thing about myself in my own hand in the winter of the 5th year and then done nothing about it for 2 years. So, on the 2nd morning, I read my own note out loud before I said anything else. The note that says, "Every house is perfect when I arrive because they know I am coming. That this makes my inspections a performance." I read it out with the date on it, and then I said that 6 people were dead, partly because the founder of this school had noticed a hole in it and had gone on riding around looking at clean floors for 2 years. Then I struck Corin Ash off the rolls for life, with every faculty head's hand up for it, and with no appeal and no term and no route back into any house in the network in any capacity that holds a blade. Not for the money, not for the shortcuts even. I told him and I told the room what he was struck off for. It was one thing out of everything in that journal, and it was the phrase brought too late. You can run out of wood, you can run out of thread, you can be one man with 2 helpers on the busiest road in the world and make a bad call at the end of a 14-hour day, and I have made worse calls than any of his. What you cannot do is write down brought too late over a woman who walked in on her own legs, because the next graduate reads that journal, and the journal says the method held and the patients were late, and the method did not hold. A false line in a journal is not a lie about the past. It is a booby trap left for whoever stands in that room next. I said that in the first intake in the 2nd year, and I struck 2 people off for it then, and I did it again. Then we read the 6 names out loud. All 6, in front of 200 people, with the cause of death after each one in the words that were actually true. I made Corin stay in the room for it, and he did. Neve, childbed fever, hands. Tam, wound closed without a drain. Ivor Sull, stopped breathing under the sleep with nobody counting. And the 3 others, blade, thread. It took about 4 minutes. 4 minutes for 6 people, and the room did not make a sound in any of it. That reading is now the fixed form of every judgment the school has ever handed down, and there have been 19. Then we did the part that actually mattered, which is that we fixed the hole. It took a week of argument with Chi and Sora and Ulda and Yun, and it produced 3 rules that are still the spine of the thing. 1. Inspection without warning by anybody the school sends, at any house at any hour, with no letter first, and the inspector is drawn by lot from a different faculty, so that nobody can be inspected by their own teacher forever. 2. The school pays for the pot. Fuel, thread, cloth, soap, and the counter's keep come out of the center. Every house, every year, whether the house takes fees or not. If the center cannot pay it, the center says so out loud. 3. No house takes a fee for treatment. Gifts go into a box on the wall with a slot. The box is opened twice a year in front of 2 witnesses from another house. The money buys fuel and thread and nothing else. Corin asked me at the end of the second day what he was supposed to do now. It is the only question he asked me in 2 days that I had no answer ready for, and I gave him a bad one. I said he could carry stretchers if Garda would have him, and Garda would. He did it for about 14 months, and he was good at it, and the carriers liked him. Then he left. He went south, and I heard 7 years later that he was keeping a bathhouse in a port town, and that he had a wife, and that he would not talk about the mountains, and that is where that ends. The 7th year closed like this: 34 clean houses, 380 students, 35,000 patients in the journals, and 410 names on the slate. I read all 380 out at the year's end. It took nearly 3 hours, and Yoon read the last 50 because my voice went in front of everybody in the way it has always gone, and nobody thought anything of it by then. 16 days after that reading, a cart came up the pass road in the snow with 1 horse and 1 driver. The driver was about 70, and he had crystal lenses on a cord around his neck. He had come alone, in winter, over a pass that kills people, in a cart with no goods in it. Garda stopped him at the boundary stone and came and got me, and she told me his name before I asked her for it. Tavis Cray came over that pass in winter at 70 years old with no goods in the cart. The first thing he asked me for was not shelter and not forgiveness. He asked to see the boy's leg. Yun was 20 by then and running the journals with 16 people under him. He came out into the snow and rolled his trouser leg up to the hip without being asked, because Garda had told him who it was. Tavis Cray knelt down in the snow in front of a herd boy from Low Hollow and looked at a white line down the outside of a thigh for a long time and put 2 fingers on it and did not say anything at all. Then he got up and went to the cart and took out 2 things. His case, the folding one with the maker's mark, with the knives and the tourniquet and the needles still in it, and 1 empty slot where the saw used to be, and a book. Guild pattern, hidebound, the sort of thing a licensed master keeps to prove his rounds to the charter office. He had kept his properly for 41 years, which most of them do not. Every limb he had ever taken, 211 of them, name, date, village, the injury that caused it, the fee, and whether the patient lived. 41 years of work in 1 book in 1 hand. The last entry in it was 7 years old. He took no limb off anybody after the spring he came back to Low Hollow for the 3rd time and was not allowed to look at the scar. He had lived on his license and his savings since. He had done the arithmetic himself, on the road, in the cold, over 19 days. He had done it in pencil in the back of his own book, and he handed it to me open at that page. Of the 211, he had marked the ones where the wound, as he had described it in his own writing, was a wound he had now seen washed, drained, and closed in a clean house. 174. That is the number in pencil at the back of his own book, in his own hand. He had written the total twice and underlined it once, and got the sum right both times. He had not rounded it. He had not given himself the benefit of the doubt in the doubtful cases, and I checked later properly with Yun. We thought his number was about 19 too high, and no more than that. 174 people, over 41 years, who kept their arms and legs in every world except this one. That is what he carried up that pass, and he had carried it for 7 years before he came. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked for work. It is all he said, standing in the snow with the book in his hand. I have never heard a man in a worse position ask for a thing more plainly. He said, I am too old to learn hands, and I do not want a blade. He said, I know how every bone setter in Marnhold thinks. I know where the charter lies. I know exactly what a village will say to your students. And then he said the sentence that got him through the door. He said it flat, in the voice he had once used to tell me that the rot goes up. He said, I taught 19 apprentices to do it the old way, and 9 of them are still working. The school nearly split over him, and the person who fought me hardest about it was not an orc and not a goblin, and not anybody with a grievance about humans. It was On. On had been with me since the first hand abscess in my 2nd month over the pass. He had counted a giant's breathing for 3 hours and 11 minutes. He had been the first counter in the world, and he had never once asked me for anything. He stood up in the long room and said that a man who has taken 211 limbs cannot be given a place in a house where limbs are kept. That the students would learn from the fact of him, and not from his mouth. Olda backed him. Pika did not, and she was the one who found the way through it, and she found it in about 4 sentences. She was 26, and she had already been teaching for 5 years. She said, "Do not give him a room with patience in it. Give him a lectern. He knows nothing we need about hands, and he knows everything we need about the argument. The argument is what kills our people on the road." So Tavis Cray never touched a patient in my school, not once in 9 years. He taught, and what he taught was the course that has saved more of my graduates' lives than the sleep rules ever saved patients. He taught them how they lose. That is the actual name of it, and I did not name it. He did on the first day, when a student asked him what the course was called. He taught the 9 things a village says. He taught them in the exact words, because he had said all 9 of them himself, in yards and squares, standing over people with a saw in his hand and being right in his own mind. The rot goes up. We have always done it this way. Half of them live. If it were that easy, the guild would know. My father took it off my grandfather. If you were a real healer, you would have a license and a cart. Show me one of the invisible animals. Nobody works for nothing. The priest closed it, and the priest is not a liar. My child is not going to be the one you practice on. And the last one, which he said is the only real one. If you are right, then what was my whole life? He taught that one for a full afternoon every intake, and he taught it as a thing to be answered gently. He taught it because he was the answer to it standing in the room. He also taught them the charter, and that was the ammunition. The guild's fee is per limb and per crutch and per month of poppy. It is written down in a public document that any clerk in Marnhold can be paid to copy. And the guild's own school teaches drainage. One line, in the section on abscess, that says the matter must be given passage. One line, taught for 90 years, and then never practiced on a limb because a limb pays 8 silver. Tavis wrote out that line for us from memory, and then we bought a copy of the guild text, and it was there, word for word, on page 19. We printed both facts on the same board and hung it in every house. The other thing that happened in the 8th year happened without me and against my expectations. It happened because of a young priestess with a wax tablet who had been keeping a record nobody had asked her to keep. Sister Alia was 24, and she served 4 villages in the low valleys. She had done what her order trained her to do, which is close wounds with the light, and she had done it 83 times in 4 years. And she had written every one of them down, not the closing, the outcome, at 30 days. Nobody in her order had ever asked for that number. I have thought a great deal about why not, and the answer is that they knew. Of her 83, 31 were dead within a month. Every one of the 31 had come to her with a wound that had already gone bad. Every one of them had died behind a beautiful sealed scar. She worked it out on her own, with no help from anybody. She was not converted by one of my graduates, and she had never met me. She had a tablet and 4 years, and the honesty to write the second number down. Then, she walked into the clean house at Elo, built 2 years after Vetch was hanged on the road to it, and asked the graduate there whether she could watch. She watched for 19 days, and on the 20th day she asked whether she could try something. What they found is the best thing that came out of the 8th year. I had nothing to do with any of it, and I have said so in public every time it has come up. The light stops bleeding instantly, better than any pressure and any tie. It does not care whether the wound is clean. It seals what is in front of it, which is why it kills people when it is used alone on a dirty wound. So do it the other way round. Open the wound, wash it out, debride it, drain it, get it clean, and then, with the wound open and clean and the bleeder in plain sight, have the priest close only what you point at. Bleeding stopped in a second instead of in 4 minutes of pressure. Clean wound, drain still in. Closure over nothing but healthy tissue. Both crafts doing the half they are actually good at. Their first 60 cases at Elo, 2 dead, against Alia's own 31 in 83, and against our own house average of about 1 in 40 for comparable wounds. Better than either method on its own, measurably. They called it the 2 hands, and not for a holy reason. There are 2 pairs of hands in the room, and neither of them can do it alone, and Elia wrote that in a letter to her own high priest before she was asked to explain herself. Radiant Oval condemned it in the spring. He did not send soldiers, and there was never a siege of anything. Every human account that says the church went to war over this is inventing drama that did not happen. What happened is that priests in villages started using it, because a priest who uses it has fewer dead parishioners, and a village notices that within 1 year. Then that village will not accept a priest who refuses. By the end of the 9th year, about half his clergy were doing it, some openly and some quietly. The ones doing it quietly were the worst problem for him because he could not count them. And here is the moment out of that whole year that I would keep if somebody made me give the rest of it back. It happened in the second room at the pass on an afternoon in the autumn. A giant called Rel, the same Rel whose armpit abscess was the first thing I ever did under sleep, came in with a thigh opened by a rockfall. The bleeder was up under the muscle where I could not get to it. That is Bo. That is exactly Bo, the boy who died on the floor of my shed in the first year with my hand, and On's hand both pressing and blood coming past both of us because the vessel had retracted out of reach. Pika was operating. I was standing in the doorway because standing in doorways is what I did by then, and Alia was in the room because Alia had come to the pass that autumn to teach the closure to 14 priests. Pika opened the thigh wider, put her whole small hand in, found the wound edge, and said, "There," and did not say anything else. Alia put 2 fingers where Pika's finger was, and the bleeding stopped in about a second. Rel walked out of that house 19 days later. I went and sat down outside afterwards on the wall by the boiling shed, and Garda came and sat with me and did not ask because she had been in the shed the night Bo died. The 8th year closed on these figures: 42 clean houses, 520 students in 5 faculties, with 3 teachers who had never been my students at all. 55,000 patients on the journals, 470 names in the ledger, 60 more than the year before. The reason is that 13 of the houses were new, and a new house is always worse than an old one for its first year. I did not read them that year. Yun read them, and Pika read a section, and Tavis Cray asked to read a section, and I let him. He read 41 names in a chapel voice and did not get one of them wrong. Then, in the last month of that year, 2 things arrived on the same day. I have always thought somebody timed it, and I have never been able to prove it. The Guild of Bonesetters struck Tavis Cray's name from its rolls and published the fact, with the word traitor in it, and Oren Vask's signature on it. The notice named 7 of the valleys we worked in, and a rider came up from the south with a copy of a proclamation. The proclamation had 11 seals on it, and Baron Ven's was the second, and the Crown's was the 11th and last. 11 baronies in coalition, in the name of the Crown of Marnhold, were marching on the cursed lands in the spring to break a sorcerous stronghold in the mountains and restore the licensed trades to the northern valleys. Dorn Stoneshoulder died in the winter before the war, in his own bed, at an age nobody could put a number on. The last thing he did was give the tally board to the school instead of to his family. He had been cutting notches into it for 23 years by then, and the new Rao, the one he started for Garda's arm and labeled kept, had run off the end of the wood and onto a second board and then a third. On carried him. Halda spoke. I did not speak, because my voice does what it does, and because there were 1,200 people on that slope, and Dorn would have found it funny to watch me try. The boards are in the long room at the Capitol now. Nobody put them in a case, and nobody wrote a plaque for them. Students lean on them while they wait for an examination, and I have not stopped it. Then, in the spring, 11 baronies came north with about 11,000 men, in the name of the Crown of Marnhold, to break a sorcerous stronghold in the mountains that did not exist. I am not a general. I want that established before anything else in this part, because the human histories have me commanding at the pass, and I was not in command of one single thing that had an enemy in front of it. Gar Hammer commanded. He was 55. He walked on a built-up boot. He could not lift his right arm above the horizontal. He had been fighting in those valleys since he was 14 years old. Ulda commanded the north road. Halda held the pass. Sora's people held the wet country in the south, which they did by letting the coalition walk into it, which took them 12 days to regret. I did 3 things in that war. 2 of them were mine, and 1 of them was Garda's. The one that was Garda's is the one that won it, and I have said that in front of a crown. The first thing I did was explain a lever, and I did it on a floor with a charcoal stick. It took about a quarter of an hour, and it is the only military idea I have ever had in my life. Giants throw stones. That is a real weapon, and it is not a joke. A giant can put a stone the weight of a man about 80 paces with a hard flat throw, and 20 giants throwing can break up a formation. 80 paces, that is the number they had lived with forever. It is set by the length of a giant's arm and the speed the end of that arm can reach, and no amount of strength changes it, because the arm is the limit. I drew a beam on the floor of the long room with a charcoal stick, with a pivot near one end, and asked Brack, who built the winch for Kel's leg, what happens to the far end when you push the short end down. Brack got it in about 4 minutes. He had built a block and rope for a leg 6 years earlier. He had never once been told that a beam does the same thing to speed that a rope does to weight. The whole of it is a ratio: short arm, long arm, pivot, counterweight, sling. A giant does not throw the stone. A giant pulls the short arm down, which is exactly what a giant is best in the world at, and the long arm does the throwing. Their first one threw a stone about 240 paces, 3 times the arm. Their fourth one, with the sling lengthened and the release tuned over a fortnight, threw about 320. That mattered twice in 2 years. At the pass in the first summer, where it broke a siege line that had settled in at 200 paces because 200 paces was safe from a giant, and at Ross Ford in the second. My entire military contribution is in that paragraph. A beam, a pivot, and a ratio, explained to a man who had already invented the rope version for a patient's leg. I have never taken any credit for it that I could avoid taking. The second thing I did was declare every clean house in the network neutral ground. It is the last thing in this part, because it is the move that actually finished the war. The third thing was Garda's. And Garda's war is the reason there is an empire, and not a graveyard with 20 monuments in it. She had one arm. She was in her 50s. She had been running 40 carriers on stretcher rotas for 4 years. When the proclamation came, she went away for 9 days and came back with a written plan. Forward points: a dressing station within about 20 minutes carry of wherever the fighting actually is, moved when the fighting moves, with 2 trained people, a pot, a fire, cloth, line, and a drain box. Not a hospital. 20 minutes. Because the thing that kills a wounded person is the 4 hours between the wound and the wash. If you cannot shorten the wash, you must shorten the walk. Behind the forward points, a clean house at every day's march down the road, so that a man is carried to a floor with a slope on it and a boiling shed the same night and not 4 days later on a cart. 240 carriers on rotas with standard stretchers of one length so that any 4 of them could pick up any load without argument. 41 forward points across 2 years. 19 houses on the line. Water on every route, in marked barrels, boiled, with a person responsible for each barrel by name. She failed 19 people over 2 years for barrel offenses, and every one of those 19 deserved it. And her rule, which she wrote herself, and which is carved into the arch of the carrier's hall at Kettle: the living are carried before the dead are collected. Nobody argues with a carrier about the order. Now the numbers, because the numbers are the war, and nothing else in this part matters half as much as the 2 figures I am about to put next to each other. Of 100 human wounded in that coalition, taken off a field and put into the care of the Crown's licensed field cutters, about 20 were alive at the end of the campaign. 20. That is not my figure. It is theirs. They lost them to the same 3 things they have always lost them to: sealed wounds, pitch, tar, and cautery, limbs taken in the 4th week by a man paid per limb, and half of those men dying of the taking. Of 100 of mine, about 80 were alive at the end of the campaign. About 70 of the 80 had gone back to whatever they did before, and most of those had done it within 3 weeks. That is the war, not the trebuchets. An army that gets 4/5 of its wounded back is fighting a different arithmetic from an army that gets 1/5. After 2 years of it, the difference is a second army. The coalition never understood it. I have read Ven's own dispatches since, in his own hand. In the second summer, he reports to the Crown that the enemy is being reinforced from the east and cannot be counted. He was not being reinforced. He was fighting the same men twice, some of them 3 times. There was a Hammer Clan spearman called Osk, who was wounded at the pass, at Ross Ford, and at the ford below Ello, and he outlived the war. We paid for it, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. 1,200 dead on our side over 2 years. The house at Ello was burned in the first autumn with 11 people inside it, 4 of them patients on mats. The graduate there was a goblin woman called Sedge, who had come out of Tup's camp in the 3rd intake. She went back in for the journal, which is exactly what the book says to do, and she did not come out. I still cannot decide whether that instruction should be in the book. It is still in the book. 14 other graduates have gone back into a burning house for a journal in 12 years, and 9 of them came out. And in the second spring, at Ross Ford, I did the thing that ended it. It was not clever, and it was not merciful, and it was the coldest calculation I have ever made in my life. I declared every clean house in the network neutral ground in writing with the seal of the school posted on the door of every house and sent by rider to every barony in the coalition. Neutral means this and only this. Any wounded person who comes to that door is treated in order of how badly they are hurt, and nothing else about them is considered, and nobody in that house may hold a weapon, which meant coalition soldiers in the same queue, ahead of our own people when their wounds were worse, which they often were because their field cutters had already had a go at them. Gar Hammer nearly took it apart. He came to me at Rossford with 2 of his own clan dead that week and told me that he would not have his men lie on the floor behind a barony pikeman with a cut leg. I gave him the count. That is all I ever had for anybody. A soldier we treat and release walks home to a village and tells 20 people that the cursed mountains washed his leg and gave it back to him. A soldier we kill costs the enemy 1 soldier. A soldier we treat costs them 20 who will not march the next spring, and takes about 1/3 of them out of the war without a single stone being thrown. He hated it. He agreed to it. He stood in front of his own clans and told them the order was by wound, in the words Dorn Stoneshoulder had used in a long house 9 years earlier, and Ulda enforced it with a stick. The first month, about 400 coalition wounded came in on their own feet, or were carried in by their friends. By the end of that summer, it was about 2,000, and it stopped being a trickle and became a policy problem. Men started coming in who had not been wounded that week. Men with old wounds, men with fingers gone bad, feet ruined by 400 miles of bad boots, and a very great many teeth. Then, whole sections started coming in together, with their weapons stacked outside the door, because coming in wounded meant staying, and coming in whole meant being sent back, and neither of them meant being hanged. Baron Ven surrendered at Rossford in the 9th month of the 2nd year, and he did not surrender to Gar Hammer. This is the part that everybody in Kettle tells wrong, so here it is properly. He came to the house at Rossford with about 40 men and a wound in his shin from his own horse's hoof, 16 days old, packed with tar by his own cutter, and hot to the knee. He came in, and the carrier on the door looked at his leg and put him forth, behind 2 of his own men and a goblin child with a broken arm, and made him sit on a bench in a corridor for about 2 hours. I did not treat him. I was not in that house that week. Pika opened that shin, and Elias stopped the bleeder, and Pika told him he would keep the leg and that he would limp, and he does. He signed the surrender in the 2nd room, on a table, using the back of a journal page, with the boiling shed making noise through the wall. He asked her whether he could have the tar off his own boots as well. About 1/3 of the people who live in my empire now came from the other side of that field, not conquered, walked in, got stitched, sat in a corridor behind a goblin child, and then did not leave. And now the price, because there is always one. And mine came in the last month of the 2nd year at the pass, and it did not come from a soldier. The 4th trebuchet had been rebuilt with a longer sling. It was Brack's crew, working it in the wet on the 11th day of a siege that was already breaking. I was not fighting. I was 80 paces behind it, walking to a forward point. The main rope parted on the release, and the arm came apart, and a piece of the iron collar off the pivot went through the crowd behind it and put fragments through 4 people, and one of them was me. It opened my right forearm from about a hand's width below the elbow down to the wrist, on the inside. It went deep, and I was on the ground, looking at my own hand, not answering me. 2 of the flexor tendons were cut through, and 1 was half cut. There was a piece of iron the size of a thumbnail against the bone. I know all of that precisely because I watched it being taken out. Pika operated. I would not have let anybody else. She was 28 by then, and she had been better than me at fine work since she was 19, and I had said so out loud in front of witnesses. Elias stopped the bleeding. I refused the sleep, and Pika let me refuse it. Then she told On to sit at my head and count anyway, because the rule has no line in it about the founder. He counted for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I lay on a table in my own 2nd room and watched a goblin repair my hand with fine line off a cliff that giants used to burn, while a priest of the light held a vessel shut and a giant counted, and I did not say one word the whole time. She got 2 tendons back and could not get the 3rd. She said so at the time, out loud, into the room. She wrote it in the journal in her own hand, in the words that were actually true. I have the hand. I can hold a pen, badly. I can grip a rail, carry a bag, point at a thing on a floor, and open a door. I cannot feel the difference between 2 threads. My third and fourth fingers do not fully close. I tried 3 times over the following year. The third time was on a clean closure on a human forearm, the easiest job in the book. I dropped the needle twice, and the second time I put it down on the cloth and stepped back. Pika finished that closure. Then she took the tool roll off the table, rolled it up, and put it back on the rack herself. She did not say anything, and neither did anybody else in that room. Numbers at the end of the 10th year: 51 clean houses, 700 students, 90,000 patients on the journals across 2 years of war, 780 names on the slate. 1,200 of the dead were ours. 310 of them are in the ledger by name with a cause. The rest are in the war roll, and I cannot look at those 2 documents on the same day. I came back over the pass in the spring with my arms strapped across my chest. I walked into the long room at the school, and about 200 people stood up, and I told them to sit down. Then I went and stood at the lectern that Tavis Cray had been using for 2 years, because it was the only place in that building where a man with 1 working hand was still worth his food. Nobody founded this empire. I have said that at a dozen public occasions and been applauded for it every time, which tells you how little attention people pay to a sentence that is simply true. A city happens like this. You put 2 rooms and a boiling shed at a crossing where people already walk. Within a year, people are coming from 4 days away and sleeping outside the door in the rain. So somebody builds a shed for them to sleep in and charges nothing at first and then a little. Then somebody sells food to the people in the shed, because a family that has carried a father for 4 days has not eaten. Then a smith, because stretchers break and pots crack and the house needs 30 hinges a year. Then a carter, because somebody has to bring the wood, and the wood bill of a clean house is the largest bill it has. Then the road, because the carter cannot get up the last 2 miles in the spring. The road takes about 7 years, and it is always the last thing. By the time the road exists, there is a town at both ends of it. 11 cities in the empire now. Every one of the 11 began as 2 rooms with a sloped floor and a shed on the left of the door. Not one of them began as a fort, a palace, a temple, or a mine. Kettle is the largest, and it is where I live. It is named after the pot. Not after me, not after a battle, not after a god. There was a boiling shed on that slope in the 3rd year, and people said, "Meet me up at the kettle." By the time anybody thought about naming it, 40,000 people were already calling it that. And Garhammer refused point blank to let the council change it to anything with a person's name in it. The way the place is run takes about 4 minutes to explain. I will explain it plainly, because the human histories make it mystical, and there is nothing mystical in it at all. The order is by wound. That is the first law, and it is the only one that was ever really fought over. Worst first, in every house, in every clinic, in every forward point, for anybody, from anywhere, at any hour. It replaced right of blood, and it did that without anybody voting against a noble. It was already the working rule in 42 houses before anybody thought of it as politics. The school is the highest body. The vote belongs to whoever teaches, not to whoever owns land, not to whoever won a battle, not to whoever is oldest, and not to me. And I have been outvoted 19 times. 5 faculties, with their own roofs and their own names on the doors. Bones, under Ulda, then under her second. Fine hands, under Pika. Sleep and apothecary, under Chi. Sanitation, under Sora. Records, under Yun. Every faculty may fail a house. Any faculty may inspect any house at any hour with no letter first. The inspector is drawn by lot from a different faculty, and that rule is 8 years old and has never been suspended. The work is divided by what each people is actually best at. This needs care, because it is the part that gets quoted at me by people who think it is a beautiful friendship. It is not friendship. It is hand size. Goblins do fine surgery and births because their fingers are half the width of mine, and a giant physically cannot close a wound on a child's hand. Orcs do bones because 4 generations of them have been setting them by feel. Giants do transport, heavy work, stone, and the weaving cliffs because a giant can carry a patient 9 hours over a ridge and can pull a beam that 20 of us cannot lift. Kobolds do the apothecary, because they know rock and salts and what dissolves in what, and because Chi invented the marked jar and no jar has left his shed unmarked in 8 years. The Marshkin do sanitation, water, latrines, laundry, and drying, because they keep a wound dry in wet air better than anybody alive, and they fail houses over it without any embarrassment whatsoever. And humans do records and copying, Because human hands are the wrong size for goblin work and the wrong size for giant work. And because the journals are the spine and somebody has to write 6 hours a day. Every house keeps a ledger of the dead, by name, with the cause in the words of the person who lost them, sent to Kettle twice a year, read out loud at the year's end. That is compulsory, and there is no house that is exempt. I have no title. The Crown of Marnhold sent a treaty in the 11th year addressed to the Emperor of the Clean Hands. I sent it back with the address struck out and corrected in my own bad handwriting. They call me the hand washer. It started as an insult in a barony, and it came over the pass as a joke, and I have never tried to stop it. It goes on the treaties now, and that is exactly right. Now the thing I count as the actual victory, and it is not the war, it is not the 11 cities, and it is not the 60 houses. It happened in a kingdom that beat me in court and then lost a war to me. Marnhold copies us, openly, under their own crown, in their own towns, in about 70 buildings now, with their own graduates. They do not pay us anything, and they never asked our permission. It started with the army. Their own officers had watched their wounded die at 4 times our rate for 2 years. After the surrender, it was the colonels and not the priests who went to the crown about it. The guild charter was amended in the 11th year. The per limb fee is gone. A bone setter in Marnhold is now paid a wage, the same wage, whether he takes the limb off or washes it out and keeps it on. That is the exact price I named to envoy Price 6 years earlier, on a slope in front of 30 people and a chest of silver. He told me it was not a price, it was a law, and he was right, and they passed it anyway. Oren Vask read the amendment out loud himself. He had to. The clause sits in the guild charter. The charter is read by the guild master at the spring court. There was nobody else in Marnhold with the office to read it. I was in that hall. I had been sent for as a witness, and I sat at the back with Yun, and I did not say one word all day, because my voice does what it does, and because there was nothing left for me to add to it. He got to the line about the wage, and he stopped. Not for effect. He looked at the page for about as long as it takes to count to 10. Then he read it out, and then he closed the book, and then he sat down. Oren Vask was not hanged, and was not exiled, and did not have his house taken. He lived another 4 years in it, on the stone stair, with a repealed clause and a trade that had stopped needing him, and then he died. The guild's own school teaches the 5 rules now. Not my words, their translation of them, in their own charter language, on page 1 instead of 1 line on page 19, about the matter being given passage. They also teach the drainage properly, which they have technically taught for 90 years. There is a lecture in that school about the 90 years, and Tavis Cray wrote to them for 4 years asking for it, and that is why it matters. A secret can be stolen off a man, and a treasure can be taken off a cart. This was never either of those, which is why it sat still for 12 years, and then went everywhere in 11,000 limbs in a year, for 90 years. That number will never be paid back, and the only thing that could ever be done about it was to make the next 90 years different. It is different in their towns, by their hands. The book from Elo came out of its chest at the signing in the 11th year. I cannot talk about that part in front of a full room without stopping in the middle. Baron Ven's household produced it. 6 years in a chest in a country house because somebody had the sense not to burn it. Guild-bound, hand-copied, the 3rd copy of the 11 made in the 5th year. Inside the front board, in a clerk's careful hand, is a note recording where it was taken from. The note gives the name of the goblin it was taken off, and it spells it correctly. Ven gave it back to me across the table with his bad leg out to the side. He said he had read it twice. He said he had read it the first time about 4 years after he hanged the boy who had recited it to him. I do not know what to do with that, and I have never known. I said thank you. I took the book. It is in the long room at Kettle, open at the front board, next to 3 tally boards that students lean on. Where everybody is now, briefly, because people ask me about them far more than they ask me about the method, and because half of them are better at this work than I ever was. Garda is 61, and she runs the carriers, which is 1,400 people now across the whole network. She has 1 arm and a scar from the elbow to the wrist that she shows to every new intake on the first morning. Pika is 31, and she is the best surgeon on this continent, and it is not a close question, and I do not say it out of affection. She has trained about 400 people, and she has never raised her voice in a room. Yun is 24. and he has 16 people under him, and he holds every journal in the empire. The white line down his thigh is the oldest piece of evidence any of us have, and he is very bored of showing it. Gar Hammer died in the 10th winter, of his heart in his hall, in the built-up boot. Ulda died 2 years later, and her name is still on the lintel, and there is a second name under it now. On counts. He is the head of the counters, of whom there are 211. He has personally sat at the head of about 4,000 patients. He still cannot open an abscess along the crease first time. Alaya is 28. She is not a heretic anymore because about half of her church does what she does. And Radiant Oval died without ever using the 2 hands, and she went to his funeral and stood at the back. Chi has claws instead of hands, and he has marked every jar in the empire for 8 years. He is the only person in Kettle who is genuinely frightened of me, and I have never worked out why. Sora fails houses. It is all she does now, and she does it about 7 times a year, and I have not overturned one of her judgments. So here are the numbers at the end of the 12th year. Then the last patient I ever stood over, because those 2 things belong on the same page. 60 clean houses, 11 of them large, 49 of them 2 rooms and a shed, 900 graduates on the rolls of 6 kinds of people, 140,000 patients on the journals in the 12th year alone, and 900 names in the ledger of the dead. I read them out at the winter reading in the long room at Kettle, and it took most of a day, and Yun read a third of them, and Pika read a third, and I read the first 3 and the last one. The first 3 are Vern, Scylla, and Bo, because they are always first. They are in charcoal on a roof slate, in a case that somebody put them in without asking me. The 4th is Brog, and next to Brog is my own name. Then Tavis Cray came into the second room at Kettle in the last month of the 12th year, on a stretcher, at about 72 years old, with his right leg rotting from a graze he had got on a step, 9 days old. Below the knee, on the shin, over the bone, where there is nothing but skin, red to the mid-thigh, and the smell was in the corridor, and his own students had already looked at it. 2 of them had written in the journal that the leg should come off at the mid-thigh. They were not being careless, and they were not being cruel. On the numbers in a man of 72, they had a case. He knew. He had spent 41 years being the man who reads that leg and gives that answer. He had it read back to him by 2 people he had taught, and he told them they had done it correctly. Then he asked for me. I came in and looked at the leg for a long time, and I pressed above and below the swelling. I could feel that the hard band stopped a hand's width below the knee and had not moved in 2 days. There was pus under the shin fascia with nowhere to go. There was dead skin over the bone that had to come off. There was a joint that was not involved, and a foot with a pulse in it that I could feel with my own thumb. That is not a leg for a saw. That is 4 hours of work, an open drain, a fortnight of dressings, and a man of 72 who might die of the 4 hours. It is a leg that stays on if the 4 hours go well. So I looked at my right hand, which cannot feel the difference between 2 threads and whose 3rd and 4th fingers do not fully close. Then I looked at Pika, who was standing by the door, and I gave her the knife. She was 4 hours and 20 minutes. Uncounted. Aaliyah was in the room and was not needed. I stood at the foot of the table the whole time, and I was asked for an opinion twice, and both times I said she was right. The leg stayed on. He was on that ward for 5 weeks, and he walked out on 2 sticks. He taught the how they lose course to the next intake sitting down. He died in his sleep 2 years later with both legs. The saw is on the wall of that operating room, his saw, the one he gave me in a lane at Low Hollow, in a wrap of oiled cloth, when I had a stone cut over one eye and nothing else in the world. It hangs above the door where everybody going out has to walk under it. There is 1 line cut into the board under it, and I chose the words, and I have never wanted to change them. This is how it was done before us. 7 words on a board under a saw, over the door of an operating room, at the height where a giant has to duck and a goblin walks under it without noticing. Nobody looks at it, which is the point of it. 900 graduates walk under that saw every year on their way to a floor with a slope on it, and to them it is a piece of ironmongery from a bad century. 16 days east of Kettle, there is a port town called Saltreach that asked to come in during the 10th year and was rebuilt around a house with 16 beds in it. It is the furthest thing from the past that we own. A ship came into Saltreach on the 9th day of the 13th year, on the tide, with her sails set badly and nobody answering. The harbor crew went out to her and boarded her and found the whole crew dead. 19 men and 1 woman. No wounds, not 1 cut, not 1 graze, not 1 broken bone, Not one thing on any of them that a needle or a drain or a boiled blade or a count to 300 has the slightest use against. There is nothing to open. There is nothing to wash, there is nothing to close, and my 5 rules, every one of which I would still carve into a lintel tomorrow, are worth exactly nothing against whatever came in on that tide. I got the letter about it 4 days later, at the lectern, in the middle of teaching an intake about hands. I read it twice, and then I put it in my pocket, and then I finished the lesson. Because I know what that letter means, and it means I have to start again from nothing, at 46, with one working hand, against something that kills from the inside, and I have no idea at all how any of it works.
Mark Hale arrived in Ordain with one habit and never acquired a second skill. He could not prove infection to anybody and stopped trying, so he wrote 5 lines a tired person could chant at 4 in the morning. He took limbs when limbs had to come off, and he wrote down everyone he lost, including the patient he killed with a dose he guessed at. Nothing was conquered. Towns grew because people walked towards a room with a slope on the floor, and because a method that cost nothing cannot be stolen, only repeated, which is why the kingdom that hanged his student now teaches his rules on page 1.